Swords and Deviltry by Fritz Lieber. Chapter 4. Met In Lankhmar. Silent as spectres, the tall and the fat thief edged past the dead, noose-strangled watch-leopard, out the thick lockpicked door of Django the gem merchant, and strolled east on Cash Street through the thin, black night smog of Lankhmar, city of 70,000 smokes. East on Cash it had to be, for west, at the intersection of Cash and Silver, was a police post with unbribed guardsmen in brown iron cuirasses and helms, restlessly grounding and rattling their pikes, while Django's place had no alley entrance or even window in its stone walls 3 spans thick, and the roof and floor almost as strong, and without trap-doors. But tall, tight-lipped Slevis, master thief and candidate, and fat, darting-eyed Fissif, thief second class, breveted first class for this operation, with a rating of talent in double dealing, were not in the least worried. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Each carried, thonged in his pouch, a much smaller pouch of jewels of the first water only, for Django, now breathing stentorously inside and senseless from the slugging he'd suffered, must be allowed, nay, nursed and encouraged, to build up his business again, and so ripen it for another plucking. Almost the first law of the Thieves' Guild was, never kill the hen that laid brown eggs with a ruby in the yolk, or white eggs with a diamond in the white. The two thieves also had the relief of knowing that, with the satisfaction of a job well done, they were going straight home, now, not to a wife, Areth forbid, or to parents and children, all gods forfend, but to Thieves' House, headquarters and barracks of the almighty guild, which was father to them both, and mother too, though no woman was allowed inside its ever-open portal on Cheap Street. In addition, there was the comforting knowledge that although each was armed only with his regulation silver-hilted thieves' knife, a weapon seldom used except in rare intramural duels and brawls, in fact more a membership token than a weapon, they were nevertheless most strongly conveyed of 3 reliable and lethal bravos hired for the evening from the Slayers' Brotherhood, one moving well ahead of them as point, the other 2 well behind as rear guard and chief striking force, in fact almost out of sight, for it is never wise that such a conveying be obvious, or so believed Krovas, Grand Master of the Thieves' Guild. And if all that were not enough to make Slevis and Fissif feel safe and serene, there danced along soundlessly beside them in the shadow of the north curb a small, malformed, or at any rate somewhat large-headed shape that might have been a small dog, or a somewhat undersized cat, or a very big rat. Occasionally it scuttled familiarly and even encouragingly a little way toward their snugly felt-slippered feet, though it always scurried swiftly back into the darker dark. True, this last guard was not an absolutely unalloyed reassurance. At that very moment, scarcely 20 paces yet from Django's, Fissif tautly walked for a bit on tiptoe, and strained his pudgy lips upward to whisper softly in Slevis' long-lobed ear, "Damned if I like being dogged by that familiar, no matter what security he's supposed to afford us. Bad enough that Krovas employs, or lets himself be cowed into employing a sorcerer of most dubious, if dire reputation and aspect, but that—" "Shut your trap!" Slevis hissed still more softly. Fissif obeyed with a shrug, and occupied himself even more restlessly and keenly than was his wont in darting his gaze this way and that, but chiefly ahead. Some distance in that direction, in fact just short of the Gold Street intersection, Cash was bridged by an enclosed second-story passageway connecting the 2 buildings which made up the premises of the famous stonemasons and sculptors Rockermans and Slarg. The firm's buildings themselves were fronted by very shallow porticos supported by unnecessarily large pillars of varied shape and decoration, advertisements more than structural members. From just beyond the bridge there came 2 low, brief whistles, signal from the Point Bravo that he had inspected that area for ambushes and discovered nothing suspicious, and that Gold Street was clear. Fissif was by no means entirely satisfied by the safety signal. To tell the truth, the fat thief rather enjoyed being apprehensive, and even fearful, well, at least up to a point. A sense of strident panic, overlaid with writhing calm, made him feel more alive than the occasional woman he enjoyed. So he scanned most closely through the thin, sooty smog, the frontages and overhangs of Rockerman's and Slarg, as his and Slavis's leisurely seeming, yet unslow pace brought them steadily closer. On this side the bridge was pierced by 4 small windows, between which were 3 large niches, in which stood, another advertisement, 3 life-size plaster statues, somewhat eroded by years of weather, and dyed varying tones of dark gray by as many years of smog. Approaching Django's before the burglary, Joseph had noted them with a swift but comprehensive over-shoulder glance. Now it seemed to him that the statue to the right had indefinably changed. It was that of a man of medium height wearing a cloak and hood, who gazed down with crossed arms and brooding aspect. No, not indefinably quite. The statue was a more uniform dark gray now, he fancied. Cloak, hood, and face. It seemed somewhat sharper featured, less eroded. He would almost swear it had grown shorter. Just below the niche, moreover, there was a scattering of gray and raw white rubble, which he didn't recall having been there earlier. He strained to remember if during the excitement of the burglary, with its lively leopard slang and slugging and all, the unsleeping watch-corner of his mind had recorded a distant crash. And now he believed it had. His quick imagination pictured the possibility of a hole, or even door behind each statue, through which it might be given a strong push, and so tumbled on to passer-by, himself and Slevis specifically, the right-hand statue having been crashed to test the device, and then replaced with a near twin. He would keep close watch on all 3 statues as he and Slevis walked under. It would be easy to dodge if he saw one start to overbalance. Should he yank Slevis out of harm's way when that happened? It was something to think about. Without pause, his restless attention fixed next on the porticos and pillars. The latter, thick and almost 3 yards tall, were placed at irregular intervals, as well as being irregularly shaped and fluted, for Rockermus and Slarg were most modern and emphasized the unfinished look, randomness, and the unexpected. Nevertheless, it seemed to Fissif, his wariness wide awake now, that there was an intensification of unexpectedness, specifically that there was one more pillar under the porticos than when he had last passed by. He couldn't be sure which pillar was the newcomer, but he was almost certainly that there was one. Share his suspicions with Slevis? Yes, and get another hissed reproof and flash of contempt from the small, dull-seeming eyes. The enclosed bridge was close now. Fissif glanced up at the right-hand statue, and noted other differences from the one he recalled. Although shorter, it seemed to hold itself more strainingly erect, while the frown carved in its dark gray face was not so much one of philosophic brooding as sneering contempt, self-conscious cleverness, and conceit. Still, none of the 3 statues toppled forward as he and Slevis walked under the bridge. However, something else happened to Fissif at that moment. One of the pillars winked at him. The Grey Mouser, so now Mouse Snow called himself, turned around in the right-hand niche, leaped up and caught hold of the cornice, silently vaulted to the flat roof, and crossed it precisely in time to see the 2 thieves emerge below. Without hesitation, he leaped forward and down, his body straight as a crossbow bolt, the soles of his rat-skin boots aimed at the shorter thief's fat-buried shoulder blades, though leading him a little to allow for the yard he'd walk while the mouser hurtled toward him. In the instant that he leaped, the tall thief glanced up over shoulder and whipped out a knife, though making no move to push or pull Fissif out of the way of the human projectile speeding toward him. The mouser shrugged in full flight. He'd just have to deal with the tall thief faster after knocking down the fat one. More swiftly than one would have thought he could manage, Fissif whirled around then and thinly screamed, "Slivikin!" The ratskin boots took him high in the belly. It was like landing on a big cushion. Writhing aside from Slovis's first thrust, the Mauser somersaulted forward, turning feet over head, and as the fat thief's skull hit a cobble with a dull thong, he came to his feet with a dirk in hand, ready to take on the tall one. But there was no need. Slovis, his small eyes glazed, was toppling also. One of the pillars had sprung forward, trailing a voluminous robe. A big hood had fallen back from a youthful face and long-haired head. Brawny arms had emerged from the long, loose sleeves that had been the pillar's topmost section, while the big fist, ending on one of the arms, had dealt Slovis a shrewd knockout punch on the chin. Fafford and the grey Mauser faced each other across the two thieves, sprawled senseless. They were poised for attack, yet each, for the moment, didn't move. Each discerned something inexplicably familiar in the other. Fafford said, "Our motives for being here seem identical." "Seem? Surely must be," the Mouser answered curtly, fiercely eyeing his potential new foe, who was taller by a head and a half than the tall thief. "You said—" "I said, seem. Surely must be." "How civilized of you," Fafford commented in pleased tones. "Civilized?" the Mouser demanded suspiciously, gripping his dirk tighter. "To care, in the eye of action, exactly what's said," Fafford explained. Without letting the Mauser out of his vision, he glanced down. His gaze traveled from the belt and pouch of one fallen thief to those of the other. Then he looked up at the Mauser with a broad and ingenuous smile. 60-60, he suggested. The Mauser hesitated, sheathed his dirk, and rapped out, "A deal." He knelt abruptly, his fingers on the drawstrings of Fissif's pouch. "Loot you Slivikin," he directed. It was natural to suppose that the fat thief had been crying his companion's name at the end. Without looking up from where he knelt, Fafford remarked, "That ferret they had with him, where did it go?" "Ferret?" the Mouser answered briefly. "It was a marmoset." "Marmoset," Fafford mused. "That's a tropical monkey, isn't it?" "Well, might have been. But I got the strange impression that the silent, two-pronged rush, which almost The silent, two-pronged rush, which almost overwhelmed them at that instant, really surprised neither of them. Each had been expecting it, but the expectation had dropped out of conscious thought with the startlement of their encounter. The three bravos racing down upon them in concerted attack, two from the west, one from the east, all with swords poised to thrust, had assumed that the two hijackers would be armed, at most, with knives, and as timid, or at least cautious in weapons combat, as the general row of thieves and counter-thieves. So it was they who were surprised and thrown into confusion when, with the lightning speed of youth, the Mauser and Fafford sprang up, whipping out fearsomely long swords, and faced them, back to back. The Mauser made a very small parry and cart, so that the thrust of the bravo from the east went past his left side, only a hair's breadth. He instantly riposted. His adversary, desperately springing back, parried in turn and cart. Hardly slowing, the tip of the Mauser's long, slim sword dropped under that parry with the delicacy of a princess curtsying, and then leaped forward and a little upward, the Mauser making an impossibly long-looking lunge for one so small, and went between two scales of the bravo's armored jerkin, between his ribs and through his heart, out his back, as if it were all angel food cake. Meanwhile, Fafford, facing the two bravos from the west, swept aside their low thrusts with somewhat larger, down-sweeping parries, then flipped up his sword, long as the Mauser's, but heavier, so that it slashed through the neck of his right-hand adversary, half decapitating him. Then he, dropping back a swift step, ready to thrust for the other. But there was no need. A narrow ribbon of bloodied steel, followed by a grey glove and arm, flashed past him from behind and transfixed the last bravo with the identical thrust the Mauser had used on the first. The two young men wiped and sheathed their swords. Fafford brushed the palm of his open hand down his robe and held it out. The Mauser pulled off right-hand grey glove and shook the other's big hand in his sinewy one. Without word exchanged, they knelt and finished looting the two unconscious thieves, securing the small bags of jewels. With an oily towel and then a dry one, the Mauser sketchily wiped his face, sketchily wiped from his face the greasy ash-soot mixture which had darkened it. Next swiftly rolled up both the towels and returned them to his own pouch. Then, after only a questioning eye-twitch east on the mouser's part, and a nod from Fafford, they swiftly walked on in the direction Slevis and Fissive, and their escort, had been going. After reconnoitering Gold Street, they crossed it and continued east on Cash at Fafford's gestured proposal. "My woman's at the Golden Lamprey," he explained. "Let's pick her up and take her home to meet my girl," the mouser suggested. "Home?" Fafford inquired politely, on the barest hint of question in his voice. "Dim Lane," the mouser volunteered. "Silver Eel?" "Behind it. We'll have some drinks." "I'll pick up a jug. Never have too much juice." "True. I'll let you." Several squares farther on, Fafford, after stealing a number of looks at his new comrade, said with conviction, "We've met before." The mouser grinned at him. "Beach by the Mountains of Hunger?" "Right. When I was a pirate ship-boy, and I was a wizard's apprentice." Fafford stopped again, wiped right hand on robe, and held it out. "Name's Fafford." Again the mouser shook it. "Grey Mouser," he said, a touch defiantly, as if challenging anyone to laugh at the sobriquet. "Excuse me, but how exactly do you pronounce that? Fafford?" "Just Fafford." "Thank you." They walked on. "Grey Mouser, eh?" Fafford remarked. "Well, you killed yourself a couple of rats tonight." "That I did." The mouse's chest swelled, and he threw back his head. Then, with a comic twitch of his nose and a sidewise half-grin, he admitted, "You'd have got your second man easily enough. I stole him from you to demonstrate my speed. Besides, I was excited." Fafford chuckled. "You're telling me. How do you suppose I was feeling?" Later, as they were crossing Pimp Street, he asked, "Learn much magic from your wizard?" Once more the mouser threw back his head. He flared his nostrils and drew down the corners of his lips, preparing his mouth for boastful, mystifying speech. But once more he found himself twitching his nose and half-grinning. What the deuce did this big fellow have that kept him from putting on his usual acts? "Enough to tell me it's damn dangerous stuff. Oh, I still fool with it now and then." Fafford was asking himself a similar question. All his life he'd mistrusted small men, knowing his height awakened their instant jealousy. But this clever little chap was somehow an exception. Quick thinker and brilliant swordsman, too, no argument. He prayed to Koss that Vlana would like him. On the northeast corner of Cash and Whore, a slow-burning torch, shaded by a broad gilded hoop, cast a cone of light up into the thickening black night smog, and another cone down on the cobbles before the tavern door. Out of the shadows into the second cone stepped Vlana, handsome in a narrow black velvet dress and red stockings, her only ornaments a silver-sheathed and hilted dagger, and a silver-worked black pouch, both on a plain black belt. Fafford introduced the Grey Mouser, who behaved with almost fawning courtesy, obsequiously gallant. Vlana studied him boldly, then gave him a tentative smile. Fafford opened under the torch of the small pouch he'd taken off the tall thief. Vlana looked down into it. She put her arms around Fafford, hugged him tight, and kissed him soundly. Then she thrust the jewels into the pouch on her belt. When that was done, he said, "Look, I'm going to buy a jug. You tell her what happened, Mouser." When he came out of the Golden Lamprey, he was carrying 4 jugs in the crook of his arm and wiping his lips on the back of his hand. Vlana was frowning. He grinned at her. The mouser smacked his lips at the jugs. They continued east on Cash. Fafford realized that the frown was for more than the jugs and the prospect of stupidly drunken male revelry. The mouser tactfully walked ahead, ostensibly to lead the way. When his figure was little more than a blob in the thickening smog, Vlana whispered harshly, "You had 2 members of the Thieves' Guild knocked out cold, and you didn't cut their throats?" "We slew 3 bravos," Fafford protested by way of excuse. "My quarrel is not with the Slavers' Brotherhood, but the abominable guild. You swore to me that whenever you had the chance—" "Vlana, I couldn't have the Grey Mouser thinking I was an amateur counter-thief consumed by hysteria and bloodlust.
You already set great store by him, don't you?
He possibly saved my life tonight.
Well, he told me that he'd have slit their throats in a wink if he'd known I wanted it that way.
He was only playing up to you from courtesy.
Perhaps, and perhaps not. But you knew, and you didn't...
Vlana, shut up.
Her frown became a rageful glare, and then suddenly she laughed wildly, smiled twitchingly, as if she were about to cry, mastered herself, and smiled more lovingly. Pardon me, darling, she said. Sometimes you must think I'm going mad. Sometimes I believe I am.
Well, don't, he told her shortly. Think of the jewels we've won instead. Behave yourself with our new friends. Get some wine inside you and relax. I mean to enjoy myself tonight. I've earned it.
She nodded and clutched his arm in agreement and for comfort and sanity. They hurried to catch up with the dim figure ahead. The Mouser, turning left, led them a half-square north on Cheap Street to where a narrower way went east again. The black mist in it looked solid. Dim lane, the Mouser explained. Fafford nodded that he knew. Vlana said, Dim's too weak, too transparent a word for it tonight, with an uneven laugh in which there were still traces of hysteria, and which ended in a fit of strangled coughing. When she could swallow again, she gasped out, Damn Lankhmar's night smog! What a hell of a city!
It's the nearness here of the great salt marsh, Fafford explained.
And he did have part of the answer. Lying low betwixt the marsh, the inner sea, the river hall, and the flat southern grain fields watered by canals fed by the Lal, Lankhmar, with its innumerable smokes, was the prey of fogs and sooty smogs. No wonder the cities had adopted the black toga as their formal garb. Some averred the toga had originally been white, or pale brown, but so swiftly soot-black and necessitating endless laundry that a thrifty overlord had ratified and made official what nature, or civilization's arts, decreed. About halfway to Carter Street, a tavern on the north side of the lane emerged from the murk. A grape-jawed serpentine shape of pale metal, crested with soot, hung high for a sign. Beneath it they passed a door curtained with grimed leather, the slit in which spilled out noise, pulsing torchlight, and the reek of liquor. Just beyond the silver eel, the mouse led them through an inky passageway out the tavern's east wall. They had to go single file, feeling their way along rough, slimy, bemisted brick, and keeping close together. Mind the puddle, Mouser warned. It's deep as the outer sea. The passageway widened. Reflected torchlight filtering down through the dark mist allowed them to make out only the most general shape of their surroundings. To the right was more windowless high wall. To the left, crowding close to the back of the silver eel, rose a dismal, rickety building of darkened brick and blackened ancient wood. It looked utterly deserted to Fafford and Vlana, until they had craned back their heads to gaze at the fourth-story attic under the ragged, guttered roof. There, faint lines and points of yellow shone around and through 3 tightly latticed windows. Beyond, crossing the T of the space they were in, was a narrow alley. Bones Alley, the Mouser told them in a somewhat lofty tone. I call it Hors d'oeuvre Boulevard. I can smell that, Vlana said. By now, she and Fafford could see a long, narrow wooden outside stairway, steep yet sagging and without a rail, leading up to the lighted attic. The Mouser relieved Fafford of the jugs and went up it quite swiftly. Follow me when I've reached the top, he called back. I think it'll take your weight, Fafford, but best one of you at a time. Fafford gently pushed Vlana ahead. With another hysteria-tinged laugh and a pause midway up for another fit of choked coughing, she mounted to the Mouser where he now stood in an open doorway, from which streamed yellow light that died swiftly in the night smog. He was lightly resting a hand on a big empty wrought-iron lamp hook firmly set in a stone section of the outside wall. He bowed aside and she went in. Fafford followed, placing his feet as close as he could to the wall, his hands ready to grab for support. The whole stairs creaked ominously, and each step gave a little as he shifted his weight onto it. Near the top, one gave way with the muted crack of half-rotted wood. Gently as he could, he sprawled himself hand and knee on as many steps as he could to distribute his weight, and he cursed sulphurously. Don't fret, "The jugs are safe," the mouser called down gaily. Fafford crawled the rest of the way, a somewhat sour look on his face, and did not get to his feet until he was inside the doorway. When he had done so, he almost gasped with surprise. It was like rubbing the verdigris from a cheap brass ring and finding a rainbow-fired diamond of the first water set into it. Rich drapes, some twinkling with embroidery of silver and gold, covered the walls except where the shuttered windows were, and the shutters of those were gilded. Similar but darker fabrics hid the low ceiling, making a gorgeous canopy in which the flecks of gold and silver were like stars. Scattered about were plump cushions and low tables, on which burned a multitude of candles. On shelves against the walls were neatly stacked like small logs a vast reserve of candles, numerous scrolls, jugs, bottles, and enameled boxes. A low vanity table was backed by a mirror of honed silver, and thickly scattered over with jewels and cosmetics. In a large fireplace was set a small metal stove, neatly blacked, with an ornate fire-pot. Also set beside the stove were a tiny pyramid of thin, resinous torches with frayed ends, fire-kindlers, and other pyramids of short-handled brooms and mops, small, short logs, and gleamingly black coal. On a long dais by the fireplace was a wide, short-legged, high-backed couch covered with a cloth of gold. On it sat a thin, pale-faced, delicately handsome girl, clad in a dress of thick violet silk, worked with silver, and belted with a silver chain. Her slippers were of white snow-serpent fur. Silver pins headed with amethysts held in place her high-piled black hair. Around her shoulders was drawn a white ermine wrap. She was leaning forward with an uneasy-seeming graciousness, and extending a narrow white hand, which shook a little to Vlana, who knelt before her, and now gently took the proffered hand, and bowed her head over it, her own glossy, straight, dark-brown hair making a canopy, and pressed the other girl's hand back to her lips. Fafford was happy to see his woman playing up properly this definitely odd, though delightful, situation. Then, looking at Vlana's long red-stocking leg, stretched far behind her as she knelt on the other, he noted that the floor was everywhere strewn, to the point of double, treble, and quadruple overlaps, with thick-piled, close-woven, many-hued rugs of the finest imported from the eastern lands. Before he knew it, his thumb had shot toward the grey Mauser. "You're the rug robber," he proclaimed. "The carpet crimp, and the candle corsair, too," he continued, referring to 2 series of unsolved thefts which had been on the lips of all Lankhmar when he and Vlana arrived a moon ago. The mouser shrugged impassive-faced at Fafford, then suddenly grinned, his slitted eyes a twinkle, and broke into an impromptu dance, which carried him whirling and jigging around the room, and left him behind Fafford, where he deftly reached down the hooded and long-sleeved huge robe from the latter's stooping shoulders, shook it out, carefully folded it, and set it on a pillow. After a long, uncertain pause, the girl in the violet nervously patted with her free hand the cloth of gold beside her, and Vlana seated herself there, carefully not too close, and the 2 women spoke together in low voices, Vlana taking the lead, though not obviously. The mouser took off his own grey hooded cloak, folded it almost fussily, and laid it beside Fafford's. Then they unbelted their swords, and the mouser set them atop folded robe and cloak. Without those weapons and bulking garments, the 2 men looked suddenly like youths, both with clear, close-shaven faces, both slender despite the swelling muscles of Fafford's arms and calves, he with long, red gold hair falling down his back and about his shoulders, the mouser with dark hair cut in bangs, the one in brown leather tunic worked with copper wire, the other in jerkin of coarsely woven grey silk. They smiled at each other. The feeling each had of turned boy all at once made their smiles for the first time a bit embarrassed. The mouser cleared his throat, and, bowing a little, but looking still at Fafford, he extended a loosely spread-fingered arm toward the golden couch, and said with a preliminary stammer, though otherwise smoothly enough, "Fafford, my good friend, permit me to introduce you to my princess. Ivrian, my dear, receive Fafford graciously if you please, for tonight he and I fought back-to-back against 3, and we conquered." Fafford advanced, stooping a little, the crown of his red gold hair brushing the bastard canopy, and knelt before Ivrian exactly as Vlana had. The slender hand extended to him looked steady now, but was still quiveringly a-tremble, he discovered as he soon touched it. He handled it as if it were silk woven of the white spider's gossamer, barely brushing it with his lips, and still felt nervous as he mumbled some compliments. He did not sense, at least at the moment, that the mouser was quite as nervous as he, if not more so, praying hard that Ivrian would not overdo her princess part and snub their guests, or collapse in trembling tears, or run to him or into the next room, for Farfred and Vlana were literally the first beings, human or animal, noble, freeman or slave, that he had brought or allowed into the luxurious nest he had created for his aristocratic beloved, save the two lovebirds that twittered in a civil cage hanging to the other side of the fireplace from the dais. Despite his shrewdness and newfound cynicism, it never occurred to the mouser that it was chiefly the charming but preposterous coddling of Ivrian that was keeping doll-like, and even more so, the potentially brave and realistic girl who had fled with him from her father's torture chamber 4 moons ago. But now, as Ivrian smiled at last, and Fafhrd gently returned her hand and cautiously backed off, the mouser relaxed with relief, fetched 2 silver cups and 2 silver mugs, wiped them needlessly with a silken towel, carefully selected a bottle of violet wine, then, with a grin at Fafhrd, uncorked instead one of the jugs the northerner brought, and near brimmed the 4 gleaming vessels, and served them all 4. With another preliminary clearing of throat, but no trace of stammer this time, he toasted, "To my greatest theft to date in Lankhmar, which, willy-nilly, I must share 60-60 with," he couldn't resist the sudden impulse, "with this great long-haired barbarian lout here," and he downed a quarter of his mug of pleasantly burning wine, fortified with brandy. Fafhrd quaffed off half of his, then toasted back, "To the most boastful and finical little civilized chap I've ever deigned to share loot with," and quaffed off the rest, and with a great smile that showed white teeth, he held out his empty mug. Mouser gave him a refill, topped off his own, then set that down to go to Ivrian and pour into her lap from their small pouch the gems he'd filched from Fisif. They gleamed in their new enviable location like a small puddle of rainbow-hued quicksilver. Ivrian jerked back a tremble, almost spilling them, but Vlana gently caught her arm, steadying it, and leaned in over the jewels with a throaty gasp of wonder and admiration, slowly turning an envious gaze on the pale girl, and began rather urgently but smilingly to whisper to her. Fafhrd realized that Vlana was acting now, but acting well and effectively, since Ivrian was soon nodding eagerly, and not long after that began to whisper back. At her direction, Vlana fetched a blue enameled box, inlaid with silver, and the 2 of them transferred the jewels from Ivrian's lap into its blue velvet interior. Then Ivrian placed the box close beside her, and they chatted on. As he worked through his second mug in smaller gulps, Fafhrd relaxed, and began to get a deeper feeling of his surroundings. The dazzling wonder of the first glimpse of this throne room in a slum, its colorful luxury intensified by contrast with the dark and mud and slime and rotten stairs and hors d'oeuvre boulevard just outside, faded, and he began to note the ricketiness and rot under the grand overlay. Black rotten wood and dry cracked wood, too, showed here and there between the drapes, and also loosed their sick ancient stinks. The whole floor sagged under the rugs as much as a span at the center of the room. A large cockroach was climbing down a gold-worked drape, another toward the couch. Threads of night smog were coming through the shutters, making evanescent black arabesques against the gilt. The stones of the large fireplace had been scrubbed and varnished, yet most of the mortar was gone from between them. Some sagged, others were missing altogether. The mouser had been building a fire there in the stove. Now he pushed in all the way the yellow flaring kindler he'd lit from the fire pot, hooked the little black door shut over the mounting flames, and turned back into the room. As if he'd read Fafhrds's mind, he took up several cones of incense, set their peaks a-smolder at the fire pot, and placed them about the room in gleaming, shallow brass bowls, stepping hard on the one cockroach, by the way, and surreptitiously catching and crushing the other in the base of his flicked fist. Then he stuffed silken rags into the widest shutter cracks, took up his silver mug again, and for a moment gave Fafford a very hard look, as if daring him to say just one word against the delightful yet faintly ridiculous doll's house he'd prepared for his princess. Next morning he was smiling and lifting his mug to Fafford, who was doing the next moment he was smiling and lifting his mug to Fafford, who was doing the same. Need of refills brought them close together. Hardly moving his lips, the mouser explained sotto voce, "Ivrin's father was a duke. I slew him by black magic, while he was having me done to death on the torture rack. A most cruel man, cruel to his daughter too, yet a duke, so that Ivrian is wholly unused to fending or caring for herself. I pride myself that I maintain her in a grander state than ever her father did, with all of his serving men and maids." Suppressing the instant criticisms he felt of this attitude and program, Fafford nodded, and said amiably, "Surely you've thieved together a most charming little palace, quite worthy of Lankhmar's overlord, Karstek Overmartes, or the King of Kings at Tilsmit." From the couch, Vlana called in her husky contralto, "Grey Mouser, your princess would hear an account of tonight's adventure, and might we have more wine?" Ivrian called, "Yes, please, Mouse." Wincing almost imperceptibly at that earlier nickname, the mouser looked to Fafford for the go-ahead, got the nod, and launched into his story. But first he served the girls wine. There wasn't enough for their cups, so he opened another jug, and after a moment of thought, uncorked all three, setting one by the couch, one by Fafford's, where he sprawled now on the pillowy carpets, and reserving one for himself. Ivrian looked wide-eyed apprehensive at this signal of heavy drinking ahead. Vlana, cynical with a touch of anger, but neither voiced their criticism. The mouser told the tale of counter-thievery well, acting it out in part, and with only the most artistic of embellishments. The mouser told the tale of counter-thievery well, acting it out in part, and only with the most artistic of embellishments. The ferret marmoset, before escaping, ran up his back and tried to scratch out his eyes, and he was interrupted only twice. When he said, "And so, with a whisk and a snick, I bared scalpel," Fafford remarked, "Oh, so you've nicknamed your sword as well as yourself?" The mouser drew himself up. "Yes, and I call my dirk Cat's Claw. Any objections? Seem childish to you?" "Not at all. I call my own sword Grey Wand. All weapons are in a fashion alive, civilized, and name-worthy. Pray, continue." And when he mentioned the beastie of uncertain nature that had gambled along with the thieves and attacked his eyes, Ivrian paled and said with a shudder, "Mouse, it sounds like a witch's familiar." "Wizards," Vlana corrected. "Those gutless guild villains have no truck with women, except as feed or forced vehicles for their lust. But Clovis, their current king, though superstitious, is noted for taking all precautions, and might well have a warlock in his service." "That seems most likely. It harrows me with dread," the mouser agreed with ominous gaze and sinister voice. He really didn't believe or feel what he said. He was about as harrowed as a virgin prairie, but, in the least, he was eagerly accepted any and all atmospheric enhancements of his performance. When he was done, the girls, eyes flashing and fond, toasted him and Fafford for their cunning and bravery. The mouser bowed, and eye twinklingly smiled about, then sprawled him down with a weary sigh, wiping his forehead with a silken cloth, and downing a large drink. After asking Vlana's leave, Fafford told the adventurous tale of their escape from Cold Corner, he from his clan, she from an acting troupe, and of their progress to Lankhmar, where they lodged now in an actor's tenement near the Plaza of Dark Delights. Ivrian hugged herself to Vlana, and shivered large-eyed at the witchy parts, at least as much in delight as fear of Fafford's tale, he thought. He told himself it was natural that a dull girl should love ghost stories, though he wondered if her pleasure would have been as great if she knew that his ghost stories were truly true. She seemed to live in worlds of imagination. Once more, at least half the mouser's doing, he was sure. The only proper matter, he admitted from the account, was Vlana's fixed intent to get a monstrous revenge on the Thieves' Guild for torturing to death her accomplices and harrying her out of Lankhmar when she'd tried freelance thieving in the city, with miming as a cover. Nor, of course, did he mention his own promise, foolish, he now thought, to help her in this bloody business. After he'd done and got his applause, he found his throat dry despite his scald's training, and when he sought to wet it, he discovered that the mug was empty, and his jug, too, though he didn't feel in the least drunk. He had talked all the liquor out of him, he told himself, a little of the stuff escaping in each glowing word he'd spoken. The mouser was in like plight, and not drunk either, though inclined to pause mysteriously and peer toward infinity before answering question or making remark. This time, he suggested, after a particularly long infinity gaze, that Farford accompany him to the eel while he purchased a fresh supply. "But we've got a lot of wine left in our jug," Ivrin protested. "Or at least a little," she amended. It did sound empty when Vlana shook it. "Besides, you've wine of all sorts here." "Not this sort, dearest. And first rule is never mix 'em," the mouser explained, wagging a finger. "That lay-wise unhealth, aye, and madness." "My dear," Vlana said, sympathetically patting Ivrin's wrist, "at some time in any good party, all the men who are really men simply have to go out. It's extremely stupid, but it's their nature, and can't be dodged, believe me." "But, Mouse, I'm scared. Farford's tale frightened me. So did yours. I'll hear that big-headed, black, ratty familiar scratch at the shutters when you're gone. I know I will." It seemed to Farford that she was not afraid at all, only taking pleasure in frightening herself and in demonstrating her power over her beloved. "Darlingest," the mouse said with a small hiccup, "there is all the inner sea, all the land of the 8 cities, and to boot, all the Troll-Step Mountains in their skyscraping grandeur between you and Farford's frigid spectres, or, pardon me, my comrade, but it could be, hallucinations admixed with coincidences. As for familiars, pish! They've never in the world been anything but the loathly, all-too-natural pets of stinking old women and womanish old men." "The eel's but a step, Lady Ivrin," Farford said, "and you'll have beside you my dear Vlana, who slew my chiefest enemy with a single cast of that dagger she now wears." With a glare at Farford that lasted no longer than a wink, but conveyed, "What a way to reassure a frightened girl!" Vlana said merrily, "Let the sillies go, my dear. 'Twill give us a chance for a private chat, during which we'll take 'em apart from wine-fumery head to restless foot." So Ivrin let herself be persuaded, and the mouser and Farford slipped off, quickly shutting the door behind them to keep out the night smog. Their rather rapid steps down the stairs could clearly be heard from within. There were faint creakings and groanings of the ancient wood outside the wall, but no sound of another tread breaking or another mishap. Waiting for the 4 jugs to be brought up from the cellar, the 2 newly met comrades ordered a mug each of the same fortified wine, or one near enough, and ensconced themselves at the least noisy end of the long serving counter in the tumultuous tavern. The mouser deftly kicked a rat that thrust its black head and shoulders from his hole. After each had enthusiastically complimented the other on his girl, Farford said diffidently, "Just between ourselves, do you think there might be anything to your sweet Ivrin's notion that the small, dark creature with Slivikin and the other guild thief was a wizard's familiar, or at any rate the cunning pet of a sorcerer, trained to act as go-between and report disasters to his master or to Crovis or to both?" The mouser laughed lightly. "You're building bugbears, formless baby ones unlicked by logic, out of nothing, dear barbarian brother, if I may say so. Imprimis, we don't really know the beastie was connected with the guild thieves at all. May well have been a stray catling or a big bold rat, like this damned one," he kicked again. "But, secundus, granting it to be the creature of a wizard employed by Crovis, how could it make useful report? I don't believe in animals that talk, well, except for parrots and such birds which only parrot, or ones having an elaborate sign language men can share. Or perhaps you envisage the beastie dipping its paddy paw in a jug of ink, writing reports in big on-floor-spread parchment. Ho there, you, back of the counter, where are my jugs? Rats eaten the boy who was sent for them days ago? Or he simply starved to death while he was on his cellar quest? Well, tell him to get a swifter move on, and meanwhile brim us again. No, Fafford, even granting the beastie to be directly or indirectly a creature of Crowis, and that it raced back to Thieves' House after our fray, what could it tell them there? Only that something had gone wrong with the burglar at Jingo's, which they'd sooner suspect in any case from the delay of the thieves and Bravo's return. Fafford frowned and muttered stubbornly, "The furry slinker might, nevertheless, convey our appearances to the guildmasters, and they might recognize us and come after us and attack us in our homes. Or Slivikin and his fat pal, revived from their bumps, might do likewise." "My dear friend," the mouser said condolingly, "once more begging your indulgence, I fear this potent wine is addling your wits. If the guild knew our looks, or where we lodge, they'd have been nastily up our necks days, weekday, months ago. Or, conceivably, you don't know that their penalty for freelance or even unassigned thieving within the walls of Lankhmar, and for 3 links outside of them, is nothing less than death, after torture, if happily that can be achieved." "I know all about that, and my plight is worse than yours," Fafford retorted, and after pledging the mouser to secrecy, told him of the tale of Lana's vendetta against the guild, and her deadly serious dreams of an all-encompassing revenge. During the story, the 4 jugs came up in the cellar, but the mouser only ordered that their earthenware mugs be refilled. Fafford finished. "And so, in consequence of a promise given by an infatuated and unschooled boy in a southern angle of the cold waste, I found myself now as a sober, well, at other times sober, man of being constantly asked to make war on a power as great as that of Karnak Overmontes, for as you may know, the guild has locals in all other cities and major towns of this land, not to mention agreements including powers of extradition with robber and bandit organizations in other countries. I love Lana dearly, make no mistake about that, but she is an experienced thief herself, without whose guidance I'd hardly have survived my first week in Lankhmar. But on this one topic, she has a kink in her brains, a hard knot neither logic nor persuasion can even begin to loosen. And I, well in the month I've been here, I've learned that the only way to survive in civilization is to abide by its unwritten rules, far more important than its laws chiseled in stone, and break them only at peril, in deepest secrecy and taking all precautions, as I did tonight. Not my first hijacking, by the way. "Certes, 'twould be insanity to assault the guild direct. Your wisdom's perfect there," the mouser commented. "If you cannot break in your most handsome girl of this mad notion, or coax her from it, and I can see she's a fearless, self-willed one, then you must stoutly refuse any least request in that direction." "Certes I must," Fafford agreed, adding somewhat accusingly, "though I gather you told her you'd have her willingly slit the throats of the 2 we struck senseless." "Courtesy merely, man. We have had me behave ungraciously to your girl? 'Tis measure of the value that I already setting them on your goodwill. But only a woman's man may cross her, as you must, in this instance." "Certes I must," Fafford repeated with great emphasis and conviction. "I'd be an idiot taking on the guild. Of course, if they should catch me, they'd kill me, in any case, for freelancing and hijacking. But wantingly to assault the guild direct, kill one guild thief needlessly, only behave as if I might, lunacy entire. You'd not only be a drunking, drooling idiot, you'd questionless be stinking in 3 nights at most from that emperor of diseases, death. Malicious attacks on her person, blows directed at the organization, the guild requites tenfold what she does other rule breakings. All planned robberies and other thefts would be called off, and the entire power of the guild and its allies mobilized against you alone. I count your chances better to take on single-handed the host of the King of Kings, rather than the Thieves' Guild's subtle minions. In view of your size, might, and wit, you're a squad, perhaps, or even a company, but hardly an army. So no, least giving in to Vlana in this one matter." "Agreed," Fafford said loudly, shaking the mouser's iron-thewed hand in a near-crusher grip. "And now, we should be getting back to the girls," the mouser said. "After one more drink while we settle the score. Ho, boy!" "Suits," the mouser dug into his pouch to pay, but Fafford protested vehemently. In the end, they tossed a coin for it, and Fafford won, and with great satisfaction clinked out his silver smerdex on the stained and dinted counter, also marked with an infinite of mug circles, as if it had been once the desk of a mad geometer. They pushed themselves to their feet, the mouser giving the rat hole one last light kick for luck. At this, Fafford's thoughts looped back, and he said, "Grant the beastie can't paw right, or talk by mouth or paw, still would have followed us at distance, marking down your dwelling, and then returned to thieves' house to lead its masters down on us like a hound." "Now you're speaking shrewd sense again," the mouser said. "Oh, boy, a bucket of small beer to go, on the instant." Noting Fafford's blank look, he explained, "I'll spill it outside the eel to kill our scent, and all the way down the passageway. Yes, and splash it on high on the walls, too." Fafford nodded wisely. "I thought I'd drunk my way past the addled point." Vlana and Ivrian, deep in excited talk, both started at the pounding rush of footsteps up the stairs. Racing behemoths could hardly have made more noise. The creaking and groaning were prodigious, and there were crashes of two treads breaking, yet the pounding footsteps never faltered. The door flew open, and their two men rushed in through a great mushroom top of night smoke, which was neatly sliced off its black stem by the slam of the door. "Told you we'd be back in a wink," the mouser cried gaily to Ivrian, while Fafford strode forward, unmindful of the creaking floor, crying, "Dearest heart, I missed you sorely," and caught up Vlana despite her voiced protest and pushings off, and kissed her hugly soundly before setting her back on the couch again. Oddly, it was Ivrian who appeared to be angry at Fafford then, rather than Vlana, who was smiling fondly if somewhat dazedly. "Fafford, sir," she said boldly, her little fists set on her narrow hips, her tapered chin held high, her dark eyes blazing. "My beloved Vlana has been telling me about the unspeakably atrocious things the Thieves' Guild did to her, and to her dearest friends. Pardon my frank speaking to one I've only just met, but I think it quite unmanly of you to refuse her the just revenge she desires and fully deserves. And that goes for you too, Mouse, who boasted to Vlana of what you would have done to you had you but known, who in like case did not scruple to slay my very own father, or reputed father, for his cruelties." It was clear to Fafford that while he and Grey Mouser had idly boozed in the eel, Vlana had been giving Ivrian a doubtless empurpled account of her grievances against the guild, and playing mercilessly on the naive girl's bookish romantic sympathies and high concept of knightly honor. It was also clear to him that Ivrian was more than a little drunk. A three-quarters empty flask of violent wine of Far Cure sat on the low table next to them. Yet he could think of nothing to do but spread his big hands helplessly and bow his head, more than the low ceiling made necessary, under Ivrian's glare, now reinforced by that of Vlana. And after all, they were right. He had promised. So it was the mouser who first tried to rebut. "Come now, pet," he cried lightly as he danced about the room, silk stuffing more cracks against the thickening night smog, and stirring up and feeding the fire in the stove. "And you too, beauteous Lady Vlana. For the past month, Fafford has been hitting the guild thieves where it hurts the most, in their purses a-dangle between their legs. His hijackings of the loot of their robberies have been like so many fierce kicks in their groins. Hurts worse, believe me, than robbing them of life with a swift, near-painless death, sword slash, or thrust. And tonight I helped him in his worthy purpose, and will eagerly do so again. Come, drink up, we all." Under his handling, one of the new jugs came uncorked with a pop, and he darted about, brimming silver cups and mugs. "A merchant's revenge," Ivrian retorted with scorn, not one whit appeased, but rather angered now. "You both are at heart true and gentle knights, I know, despite all current backsliding. At the least you must bring Vlana the head of Krovas." "What would she do with it? What good would it be except to spot the carpets?" the mouser plaintively inquired, while Fafford, gathering his wits at last, and going down on one knee, said slowly, "Most respected Lady Ivrian, it is true, I solemnly promised my beloved Vlana I would help her in her revenge. But that was while I was still in barbarous cold corner, where blood feud is a commonplace, sanctioned by custom and accepted by all the clans and tribes and brotherhoods of the savage northerners of the cold waste. In my naivete, I thought of Lana's revenge as being of that sort. But here in civilization's midst, I discovered all's different, rules, customs turned upside down. Yet, Lankhmar or Cold Corner, one must seem to observe rule and custom to survive. Here, cash is all-powerful, the idol placed highest, whether one sweat, thieve, grind others down, or scheme for it. Here, feud and revenge are outside all rules, and punished worse than violent lunacy. Think, Lady Ivrin, if Mouse and I should bring Vlana the head of Crovis, she and I would have to flee Lankhmar on the instant, every man's hand against us, while you, infallibly, would lose this fairyland Mouse has created for you, created for love of you, and be forced to do likewise, be with him a beggar on the run for the rest of your natural lives. It was beautifully reasoned and put, and no good whatsoever. While Farford spoke, Ivrin snatched up her new-filled cup and drained it. Now she stood up straight as a soldier, her pale face flushed, and said scathingly to Farford kneeling before her, "You count the cost? You speak to me of things," she waved at the many-hued splendor around her, "of mere property, however costly, when honor is at stake? You gave Vlana your word. Oh, is knighthood wholly dead? And that applies to you, too, Mouse, who swore you'd slit the miserable throats of two noisome guild thieves." "I didn't swear to," the Mouser objected feebly, downing a big drink. "I merely said I would have," while Fafford could only shrug and writhe inside and gulp a little in easement from his silver mug. For Ivrian was speaking in the same guilt-showering tones, and using the same unfair, yet heart-cleaving, womanly arguments, as Mor his mother might have, or Mara, his deserted snow-clad sweetheart and avowed wife, big-bellied by now with his child. In a masterstroke, Vlana tried gently to draw Ivrian down to her golden seat again. "Softly, dearest," she pleaded. "You have spoken nobly for me and my cause, and believe me, I am most grateful. Your words revived in me great fine feelings dead these many years. But of us here, only you are truly an aristocrat attuned to the highest priorities. We other three are naught but thieves. Is it any wonder some of us put safety above honor and word-keeping, and most prudently avoid risking our lives? Yes, we are three thieves, and I am outvoted, so please speak no more of honor and rash, dauntless bravery. But sit you down and—" "You mean they're both afraid to challenge the Thieves' Guild, don't you?" Ivrin said, eyes wide and face twisted by loathing. "I always thought my Mouse was a nobleman first, and a thief second. Thieving's nothing. My father lived by cruel thievery done on rich wayfarers and neighbors less powerful than he, yet he was an aristocrat. Oh, you're cowards, both of you. Poltroons," she finished, turning her eyes flashing with cold scorn, first on the Mouser, then on Fafford. The latter could stand it no longer. He sprang to his feet, face flushed, fist clenched at his sides, quite unmindful of his down-clattered mug and the ominous creak of his sudden action drew from the sagging floor. "I am not a coward," he cried. "I'll dare thieves' house, and fetch you Crovis head, and toss it with blood a-drip at Vlana's feet. I swear that, witness me, cost the god of dooms, by the brown bones of Nalgron, my father, and by his sword, Greywand, here at my side." He slapped his left hip, found nothing there but his tunic, and had to content himself with pointing, trumble-armed, at his belt and scabbarded sword where they lay atop his neatly folded robe, and then, picking up, refilling splashily, and draining his mug. The grey Mouser began to laugh in high, delighted, tuneful peals. All stared at him. He came dancing up beside Fafford, and still smiling widely asked, "Why not? Who speaks of fearing the guild thieves? Who becomes upset at the prospect of this ridiculously easy exploit, when all of us know that all of them, even Crovis and his ruling clique, are but pygmies in mind and skill compared to me or Fafford here? A wonderfully simple, foolproof scheme has just occurred to me for penetrating thieves' house, every closet and cranny. Stout Fafford and I will put it into effect at once. Are you with me, Northerner?" "Course I am," Fafford responded gruffly, at the same time frantically wondering what madness had gripped the little fellow. "Give me a few heartbeats to gather needed props, and we're off," the mouser cried. He snatched from a shelf and unfolded a stout sack, then raced about, thrusting into it coiled ropes, bandage rolls, rags, jars of ointment and unction, and unguent, and other oddments. "But you can't go tonight," Ivrian protested, suddenly grown pale and uncertain voice. "You're both in no condition to." "You're both drunk," Lana said harshly. "Silly drunk. And that way you'll get naught in thieves' house but your deaths. Fafford, where's that heartless reason you employed to slay or ice-vein sea-slain a clutch of mighty rivals and win me at Cold Corner, and in the chilly sorcery-webbed depths of Trollstep Cavern? Revive it, and infuse some into your skipping grey friend." "Oh no," Fafford told her as he buckled on his sword. "You wanted the head of Crovis heaved at your feet in great splatter of blood, and that's what you're going to get, like it or not." "Softly, Fafford," the mouse interjected, coming to a sudden stop and drawing tight the sack's mouth by its strings. "And softly you too, Lady Vlana, my dear princess. Tonight I intend but a scouting expedition. No risks run, only the information gained needful for planning our murderous strike, tomorrow or the day after. So, no head choppings whatsoever tonight, Fafford, do you hear me? Whatever may hap, hiss the word, and don your hooded robe." Fafford shrugged, nodded, and obeyed. Ivrian seemed somewhat relieved. Vlana, too, though she said, "Just the same, you're both drunk." "All to the good," the mouser assured her with a mad smile. "Drink may slow a man's sword arm and soften his blows a bit, but it sets his wits ablaze and fires his imagination, and those are the qualities we'll need tonight. Besides," he hurried on, cutting off some doubt Ivrian was about to voice, "drunken men are supremely cautious. You ever seen a staggering sot pull himself together at sight of the guard and walk circumspectly and softly past?" "Yes," Vlana said, "and fall flat on his face just as he comes abreast of them." "Pish," the mouser retorted, and throwing back his head, grandly walked toward her along an imaginary straight line. Instantly he tripped over his own foot, plunged forward, suddenly without touching the floor, did an incredible forward flip, heels over head, and landed erect and quite softly, toes, ankles, and knees bending at just the right moment to soak up impact, directly in front of the girls. The floor barely complained. "You see," he said, straightening up and unexpectedly reeling backward. He tripped over the pillow on which lay his cloak and sword, but by a wrenching twist and a lurch, stayed upright, and began rapidly to accouter himself. Under cover of this action, Fafford made quietly yet swiftly to fill once again his and the mouser's mugs, but Vlana noted it and gave him such a glare that he set down mugs and uncorked jugs so swiftly his robe swirled, then stepped back from the drinks table with a shrug of resignation, and toward Vlana a grimacing nod. The mouser shouldered his sack and drew open the door. With a casual wave at the girls, but no word spoken, Fafford stepped out on the tiny porch. The night smog had grown so thick he was almost lost to view. The mouser waved 4 fingers at Ivrian, softly called, "Bye-bye, Misling," then followed Fafford. "Good fortune go with you," Vlana called heartily. "Oh, be careful, mouse," Ivrian gasped. The mouser, his figure slight against the loom of Fafford's, silently drew shut the door. Their arms automatically gone round each other, the girls waited for the inevitable creaking and groaning of the stairs. It delayed and delayed. The night smog that had entered the room dissipated, and still the silence was unbroken. "What can they be doing out there?" Ivrian whispered. "Plotting their course?" Vlana, scowling, impatiently shook her head, then disentangled herself, tiptoed to the door, opened it, descended softly a few steps, which creaked most dolefully, then returned, shutting the door behind her. "They're gone," she said in wonder, her eyes wide, her hands spread a little to either side, palms up. "I'm frightened," Ivrian breathed, and sped across the room to embrace the taller girl. Vlana hugged her tight, then disengaged an arm to shoot the door's 3 heavy bolts. In Bones Alley, the mouser returned to his pouch the knotted line by which they'd descended from the lamp hook. He suggested, "How about stopping at the Silver Eel?" "You mean and just tell the girls we've been to Thieves' House?" Farford asked, not too indignantly. "Oh, no," Mouser protested. "But you missed your stirrup cup upstairs." "So did I." At the word stirrup, he looked down at his rat-skin boots, and then, crouching again, began a little gallop in one place, his boot soles clopping softly on the cobbles. He flapped imaginary reins. "Giddy up!" and quickened his gallop, but leaning sharply back, pulled to a stop. "Whoa!" when, with a crafty smile, Fafford drew from his robe 2 full jugs. "Palmed them, as it were, when I set down the mugs. Flaunis sees a lot, but not everything." "You are a prudent, far-sighted fellow, in addition to having some skill at sword taps," the mouser said admiringly. "I'm proud to call you comrade." Each uncorked and drank a hearty slug. Then the mouser led them west, they veering and stumbling only a little. Not so far as Cheap Street, however, but turning north into an even narrower and more noisome alley. "Plague Court," the mouser said. Fafford nodded. After several preliminary peepings and peerings, they staggered swiftly across wide, empty Craft Street and into Plague Court again. For a wonder, it was growing a little lighter. Looking upward, they saw stars. Yet there was no wind blowing from the north. The air was deathly still. In their drunken preoccupation with the project at hand, and mere locomotion, they did not look behind them. There the night smog was thicker than ever. A high-ceilinged night hawk would have seen the stuff converging from all sections of Lankhmar, north, east, south-west, from the inner sea, from the great salt marsh, from the many-ditched grainlands, from the river Halal, in swift-moving black rivers and rivulets, heaping, eddying, swirling dark and reeking essence of Lankhmar, from its branding irons, braziers, bonfires, bone fires, kitchen fires and warmth fires, kilns, forges, breweries, distilleries, junk and garbage fires innumerable, sweating alchemists and sorcerers' dens, crematoriums, charcoal burners' turfed mounds, all those and many more, converging purposefully on Dim Lane, and particularly on the Silver Eel, and perhaps especially on the rickety house behind it, untenanted, except for the attic. The closer to that center it got, the more substantial the smoke became, eddy strands and swirl tatters tearing off and clinging to rough stone corners and scraggly surface bricks like black cobwebs. A high-circling nighthawk would have seen the stuff converging from all sections of Lankhmar, north, east, south-west, from the inner sea, from the great salt marsh, from the many-ditched grainlands, from the river Halal. But the mouser and Fafford merely exclaimed in mild, muted amazement at the stars, muggily amused as to how much the improved visibility would increase the risk of their quest, and cautiously crossing the street of thinkers, called Atheist Avenue by moralists, continued to Plague Court until it forked. The mouser chose the left branch, which trended northwest. Death Alley. Fafford nodded. After a curve and recurve, Cheap Street swung into sight about 30 paces ahead. The mouser stopped at once, and lightly threw an arm against Fafford's chest. Clearly in view across Cheap Street was a wide, low, open doorway, framed by grimy stone blocks. There led up to it 2 steps hollowed by the treadings of centuries. Orange-yellow light spilled out from bracketed torches inside. They couldn't see very far in because of Death Alley's angle. Yet, as far as they could see, there was no porter or guard in sight, nor anyone at all, not even a watchdog on a chain. The effect was ominous. "Now how do we get into the damn place?" Farford demanded, in a hoarse whisper. "Scout Murder Alley for a back window that can be forced? You've prize in the sack, I trow. Or the roof? You're a roof man, I know already. Teach me the art. I know trees and mountains, snow, ice, and bare rock. See this wall here?" He backed off from it, preparing to up it in a rush. "Steady on, Farford," the mouser said, keeping his hand against the big young man's chest. We'll hold the roof in reserve. Likewise all walls. And I'll take it on trust you're a master climber. As to how we get in, we walk straight through that doorway." He frowned. "Tap and hobble, rather. Come on while I prepare us." As he drew the skeptically grimacing Fafford back down Death Alley until all Cheap Street was again cut off from view, he explained. "We'll pretend to be beggars, members of their guild, which is but a branch of the Thieves' Guild, and houses with it, or at any rate, reports into the beggar masters at Thieves' House. We'll be new members who've gone out by day, so it'll not be expected the night beggar master and any night watchman would know our looks." "But we don't look like beggars," Fafford protested. "Beggars have awful sores and limbs all a-twist or lacking altogether." "That's just what I'm going to take care of now," the mouser chuckled, drawing scalpel. Ignoring Fafford's backward step and wary glance, the mouser gazed puzzledly at the long tapering strip of steel he'd bared, then, with a happy nod, unclipped from his belt scalpel scabbard, furnished with rat skin, sheathed the sword, and swiftly wrapped it up, hilt and all, in a spiral, with the wide ribbon of a bandage roll dug from his sack. "There," he said, knotting the bandage ends. "Now I've a topping cane." "What's that?" Fafford demanded. "And why?" "Because I'll be blind, that's why." He took a few shuffling steps, tapping the cobblestones ahead with wrapped sword, gripping it by the quillions or crossguard, so that the grip and pommel were up his sleeve, and groping ahead with his other hand. "That look all right to you?" he asked Fafford as he turned back. "Feels perfect to me. Bat blind, eh?" "Oh, don't fret, Fafford. The rag's but gauze. I can see through it fairly well. Besides, I don't have to convince anyone inside Thieves' House I'm actually blind. Most guild beggars fake it, as you must know. Now, what to do with you? Can't have you blind also. Too obvious. Might wake suspicion." He uncorked his jug and sucked inspiration. Fafford copied this action, just on principle. The mouser smacked his lips and said, "I've got it. Fafford, stand on your right leg and double up your left behind you at the knee. Hold, don't fall on me. Avant! But steady yourself by my shoulder. That's right. Now, get that left foot higher. We'll disguise your sword like mine for a crutch cane. It's thicker and it'll look just right. You can also steady yourself with your other hand on my shoulder as you hop. The halt leading the blind. Always good for a tear, always good theater. But higher with that left foot. No, it doesn't come off. We'll have to rope it. But first, unclip your scabbard." Soon the mouser had Grey Wand and its scabbard in the same state as scalpel, and was tying Fafford's left ankle to his thigh, drawing the rope cruelly tight, though Fafford's wine-anesthetized nerves hardly registered it. Balancing himself with his steel-corded crutch cane as the mouser worked, he swigged from his jug and pondered deeply. Ever since joining forces with Vlana, he'd been interested in the theater, and the atmosphere of the actor's tenement had fired that interest further, so that he was delighted at the prospect of acting a part in real life. Yet, brilliant as the mouser's plan undoubtedly was, there did seem to be drawbacks to it. He tried to formulate them. Yet, brilliant as the mouser's plan undoubtedly was, there did seem to be drawbacks to it. He tried to formulate them. "Mouser," he said, "I don't know as I like having our swords tied up so we can't draw 'em in an emergency." "We can still use 'em as clubs," the mouser countered, his breath hissing between his teeth as he drew the last knot hard. "Besides, we'll have our knives. Say, pull your belt around until yours is behind your back, so your robe will hide it. I'll do the same with cat's claw. Beggars don't carry weapons, at least in view, and we must maintain dramatic consistency in every detail. Stop drinking now, you've had enough. I myself need only a couple swallows more to reach my finest pitch. And I don't know as I like going hobbled into that den of cutthroats. I can hop amazingly fast, it's true, but not as fast as I can run. Is it really wise, do you think?" "You can slash yourself loose in an instant," the mouser hissed with a touch of impatience and anger. "Aren't you willing to make it the least sacrifice for art's sake?" "Oh, very well," Fafford said, draining his jug and tossing it aside. Yes, of course I am. Your complexion's too hale, the mouser said, inspecting him critically. He touched up Faffer's features and hands with pale gray grease paint, then added wrinkles with dark. And your garb's too tidy. He scooped dirt from between the cobbles and smeared it on Faffer's robe, then tried to put a rip in it, but the material resisted. He shrugged and tucked his lightened sack under his belt. "So's yours," Fafford observed, and stood on his right leg, got a good handful of muck himself, or dur by its feel. Heaving himself up with a mighty effort, he wiped the stuff off on the mouser's cloak and gray silken jerkin too. Small man got the odor and cursed. "Dramatic consistency," Fafford reminding him. "It's well we stink." "Beggars do. That's one reason folk give 'em coins, to get rid of 'em. And no one at Thieves' House will be eager to inspect us close. Now come on, while our fires are still high." And grasping hold of the mouser's shoulder, he propelled himself rapidly toward Cheap Street, setting his bandaged sword between cobbles well ahead and taking mighty hops. "Slow down, idiot," the mouser cried softly, shuffling along with the speed almost of a skater to keep up, while tapping his sword cane like mad. "A cripple's supposed to be feeble. That's what draws the sympathy." Fafford nodded wisely and slowed somewhat. The ominous empty doorway slid again into view. The mouser tilted his jug to get the last of his wine, swallowed a while, then choked sputteringly. Fafford snatched and drained the jug, then tossed it over his shoulder to shatter noisily. They hop-shuffled into Cheap Street, halting almost at once for a richly clad man and a woman to pass. The richness of the man's garb was sober, and he was on the fat and older side, though hard-featured. A merchant, doubtless, with money in the Thieves' Guild, protection money at least, to take this route at this hour. The richness of the woman's garb was garish, though not tawdry, and she was beautiful and young and looked still younger. A competent courtesan, almost certainly. The man started to veer around the noisome and filthy pair, his face averted, but the girl swung toward Mouser, concern growing in her eyes with hothouse swiftness. "Oh, you poor boy. Blind. What a tragedy," she said. "Give us a gift for him, lover." "Keep away from those stinkers, Misra, and come along," he retorted, the last of his speech vibrantly muffled, for he was holding his nose. She made him no reply, but thrust white hand into his ermine pouch, and swiftly pressed a coin against the mouser's palm, and closed his fingers on it, then took his head between her palms, and kissed him sweetly on the lips, before letting herself be dragged on. Good care of the little fellow, old man," she called fondly back to Fafford, while her companion grumbled muffled reproaches at her, of which only perverted bitch was intelligible. The mouser stared at the coin in his palm, then sneaked a long look after his benefactress. There was a dazed wonder in his voice as he whispered to Fafford, "Look! Gold! A golden coin, and a beautiful woman's sympathy. Think you we should give over this rash project, and for a profession take up beggary?" "Buggery, even, rather," Fafford answered, harsh and low. "That old man rankled me. Onward we, bravely." They upped the two worn steps, and went through the doorway, noting the exceptional thickness of the wall. Ahead was a long, straight, high-ceilinged corridor, ending in stairs and with doors spilling light at intervals, and well-set torches adding their flare, but empty at its length. They had just got through the doorway when cold steel chilled the neck and pricked the shoulder of each of them. From just above, two voices commanded in unison, "Halt!" Although fired and fuddled by fortified wine, they each had wit enough to freeze and then, very cautiously, look upward. Two gaunt, scarred, exceptionally ugly faces, each topped by a gaudy scarf binding back hair, looked down at them from a deep niche just above the doorway, and helping explain its lowness. Two bent, gnarly arms thrust down the swords that still pricked them. "Gone out with a noon beggar batch, eh?" one of them observed. "Well, you'd better have a high take to justify your tardy return. The night beggarmaster's on a Horse Street furlough. Report above to Crovus. Gods, you stink! Better clean up first, or Clovis will have you bathed in live steam. Begone! The Mouser and Fafford shuffled and hobbled forward at their most authentic. One Nishgard cried after them, "Relax, boys, you don't have to put it on here." "Practice makes perfect," the Mouser called back in a quavering voice. Fafford's finger ends dug his shoulder warningly. They moved along somewhat more naturally, so far as Fafford's tied-up leg allowed. "Gods, what an easy life the guild beggars have," the other Nishgard observed to his mate. "What slack discipline and low standards of skill. Perfect, my sacred butt. You'd think a child could see through those disguises." "Doubtless some children do," his mate retorted. "But their dear mothers and fathers only drop a tear in a coin, or give a kick. Grown folks go blind, lost in their toil and dreams, unless they have a profession, such as thieving, which keeps them mindful of things as they really are." Resisting the impulse to ponder this sage philosophy, and glad they would not have to undergo a beggar-master's shrewd inspection. Truly, thought Fafford, Cause of the Doom seemed to be leading them direct to Clovis, and perhaps head-chopping would be the order of the night. He and Mouser went watchfully and slowly on, and now they began to hear voices, mostly curt and clipped ones, and other noises. They passed some doorways they'd like to have paused at to study the activities inside, yet the most they dared do was slow down a bit more. Fortunately, most of the doorways were wide, permitting a fairly long view. Very interesting were some of those activities. In one room, young boys were being trained to pick pouches and slit purses. They'd approach from behind an instructor, and if you heard scruff of bare foot, or felt touch of dipping hand, or worse, heard clunk of drop leaden mock coin, that boy would be thwacked. Others seemed to be getting training in group tactics, the jostle in front, the snatch from behind, the swift passing of lifted items from youthful thief to confederate. In a second room, from which pushed air heavy with the reeks of metal and oil, older student thieves were doing laboratory work in lockpicking. One group was being lectured by a grimy-handed graybeard, who was taking apart a most complex lock, piece by weighty piece. Others appeared to be having their skill, speed, and ability to work soundlessly tested. They were probing with slender picks the keyholes in half a dozen doors set side by side in an otherwise purposeless partition, while a supervisor holding a sandglass watched them keenly. In a third, these were eating at long tables. The odors were tempting, even to men full of booze. The guild did well by its members. In a fourth, the floor was padded in part, and instruction was going on in slipping, dodging, ducking, tumbling, tripping, and otherwise foiling pursuit. These students were older, too. A voice like a sergeant major's rasped, "Nah, nah, nah. You couldn't give your crippled grandmother the slip. I said duck, not genuflect to holy wrath. Now, this time." "Griff's used to grease," an instructor called. "He has, eh? To the front, Griff." The rasping voice replied as the Mouser and Fafford moved somewhat regretfully out of sight, for they realized much was to be learned here, tricks that might stand them in good stead even tonight. "Listen, all of you," the rasping voice continued, so far carrying it followed them a surprisingly long way. "Grease may be very well on a night job. By day, its glisten shouts that its user's profession to all Nuhon. But in any case, it makes a thief overconfident. He comes to depend on it, and then in a pinch he finds he's forgot to apply it. Also, its aroma can betray him. Here we work always dry-skinned, save for natural sweat. All of you were told first night, bend over, Griff. Grasp your ankles and straighten your knees." More thwacks, followed by yelps of pain, distant now since the Mouser and Fafford were halfway up the end stairs, Fafford vaulting somewhat laboriously as he grasped curving banister and swaddled sword. The second floor duplicated the first, but was as luxurious as the other had been bare. Down the long corridor lamps and filigreed incense pots pendant from the ceiling alternated, diffusing a mild, light, and spicy smell. The walls were richly draped, the floor thick carpeted. Yet this corridor was empty too, and, moreover, completely silent. After a glance at each other, they started off boldly. The first door, wide open, showed an untenanted room full of racks of garments, rich and plain, spotless and filthy, Also, wig stands, shelves of beards and such, and several wall mirrors, faced by small tables crowded with cosmetics and with stools before them. A disguising room, clearly. After a look and listen either way, the mouser darted in and out to snatch up a large green flask from the nearest table. He unstoppered and sniffed it. A rotten sweet gardenia reek contended with the nose sting of spirits of wine. The mouser sloshed his and Fafford's fronts with this dubious perfume. Antidote to hors d'oeuvre, he explained with the pomp of a physician, stomping the flask. Don't want to be parboiled by Clovis. No, no, no. Two figures appeared at the far end of the corridor and came toward them. The mouser hid the flask under his cloak, holding it between elbow and side, and he and Fafford continued onward. To turn back would look suspicious, both drunkenly judged. The next 3 doorways they passed were shut by heavy doors. As they neared the 5th, the 2 approaching figures, coming on arm in arm, yet taking long strides, moving more swiftly than the hobble shuffle, became distinct. Their clothing was that of noblemen, but their faces were those of thieves. They were frowning with indignation and suspicion, too, at the mouser and Fafford. Just then, from somewhere between the 2 man pairs, it sounded. A voice began to speak words in a strange tongue, using the rapid monotone priests employ in routine service, or some sorcerers in their incantations. The 2 richly clad thieves slowed at the 7th doorway and looked in. Their progress ceased altogether. Their necks strained, their eyes widened. They visibly paled. Then, of a sudden, they hastened onward, and, almost running, bypassed Fafford and the mouser as if they were furniture. The incantatory voice drummed on without missing a beat. The 5th doorway was shut, but the 6th was open. The mouser peeked in with one eye, his nose brushing the jamb. Then he stepped forward and gazed inside with entranced expression, pushing the black rag up on his forehead for better vision. Fafford joined him. It was a large room, empty so far as could be told of human and animal life, but filled with most interesting things. From knee-height up, the entire far wall was a map of the city of Lankhmar and its immediate surrounds. Every building and street seemed depicted, down to the meanest hovel and narrowest court. There were signs of recent erasure and redrawing at many spots, and here and there little colored hieroglyphs of mysterious import. The floor was marble, the ceiling blue as lapis lazuli. The side walls were thickly hung by ring and paddock. One was covered with all manner of thieves' tools, from a huge thick pry bar that looked as if it could unseat the universe, or at least the door of the overlord's treasure vault, to a rod so slim it might be an elf-queen's wand, and seemingly designed to telescope out and fish from distance for precious gauds on milady's spindle-legged ivory-topped vanity table. The other wall had on it all sorts of quaint, gold-gleaming, and jewel-flashing objects, evidently mementos chosen for their oddity from the spoils of memorable burglaries, from a female mask of thin gold, breathlessly beautiful in its features and contours, but thickly set with rubies simulating the spots of the pox in its fever stage, to a knife whose blade was wedge-shaped diamond set side by side, and this diamond cutting edge looking razor-sharp. All about were tables set chiefly with models of dwelling houses and other buildings, accurate to their last minutiae, it looked, of ventilation hole under gutter roof, and ground-level drain hole, of creviced wall and smooth. Many were cut away in partial or entire section to show the layout of rooms, closets, strong rooms, doorways, corridors, secret passages, smokeways, and airways, in equal detail. In the center of the room was a bare round table of ebony and ivory squares. About it were set 7 straight-backed, well-padded chairs, the one facing the map away from the mouser and Fafford being higher-backed and wider-armed than the others, a chief's chair, likely that of Clovis. The mouser tiptoed forward, irresistibly drawn, but Fafford's left hand clamped down on his shoulder like the iron mitten of a Mingal cataphract, and drew him irresistibly back. Scowling his disapproval, the northerner brushed down the black rag over the mouser's eyes again, and with his crutch hand thumbed ahead, then set off in that direction in most carefully calculated silent hops. With a shrug of disappointment, the mouser followed. As soon as they had turned away from the doorway, but before they were out of sight, a neatly black-bearded, crop-haired head came like a serpent's around the side of the highest-backed chair, and gazed after them from deep-sunken yet glinting eyes. Next, a snake's supple long hand followed the head out, crossed thin lips with ophidian forefinger for silence, and then finger beckoned the two pairs of dark tunicked men who were standing to either side of the doorway, their backs to the corridor wall, each of the four gripping a curvy knife in one hand and a dark leather lead-weighted bludgeon in the other. When Fafford was halfway to the seventh doorway, from which the monotonous yet sinister recitation continued to well, there shot out through it a slender, whey-faced youth, his narrow hands clapped over his mouth, under terror-wide eyes, as if to shut in screams or vomit, and with a broom clamped in an armpit, so that he seemed a bit like a young warlock about to take to the air. He dashed past Fafford and the Mauser, and away, his racing footsteps sounding rapid dull on the carpeting, and hollow sharp on the stairs before dying away. Fafford gazed back at the Mauser with a grimace and a shrug, then, squatting one-legged until the knee of his bound-up leg touched the floor, advanced half his face past the door-jamb. After a bit, without otherwise changing position, he beckoned the Mauser to approach. The latter slowly thrust half his face past the jamb, just above Fafford's. What they saw was a room somewhat smaller than that of the great map, and lit by central lamps that burned blue-white instead of customary yellow. The floor was marble, darkly colorful and complexly whorled. The dark walls were hung with astrological and anthropomorphic charts, and instruments of magic, and shelved with cryptically labeled porcelain jars, and also with vitreous flasks and glass pipes of the oddest shapes, some filled with colored fluids, but many gleamingly empty. At the foot of the walls, where the shadows were thickest, broken and discarded stuff was irregularly heaped, as if swept out of the way and forgot, and here and there opened a rather large rat-hole. In the center of the room, and brightly illuminated by contrast, was a long table with thick top and many stout legs. The Mauser thought fleetingly of a centipede, and then of the bar at the eel, for the tabletop was densely stained and scarred by many a spilled elixir, and many a deep black burn by fire or acid, or both. In the midst of the table was an alembic working. The lamp's flame, deep blue this one, kept a boil in the large crystal curbit, a dark viscous fluid, with here and there diamond glints. From out of the thick seething stuff, strands of a darker vapor streamed upward, to crowd through the curbit's narrow mouth and stain, oddly, with bright scarlet, the transparent head, and then, dead black now, flow down the narrow pipe from the head into a spherical crystal receiver, larger even than the curbit, and there curl and weave about, like so many coils of living black cord, an endless skinny ebon serpent. Behind the left end of the table stood a tall yet hunchbacked man in black robe and hood, which shadowed more than hid a face of which the most prominent features were a long, thick, pointed nose, with out-jutting, almost chinless mouth just below. His complexion was sallow gray, like clay, and a short-haired, bristly gray beard grew high on his wide cheeks. From under a receding forehead and bushy gray brows, wide-set eyes looked intently down at an age-brown scroll, which his disgustingly small club hands, knuckles big, short backs, gray-bristled, ceaselessly unrolled and rolled up again. The only move his eyes ever made, besides the short side-to-side one as he read the lines as he was rapidly intoning, was an occasional farther sideways glance at the alembic. On the other end of the table, beady eyes darting from the sorcerer to the alembic and back again, crouched a small black beast, the first glimpse of which made Fafford dig fingers painfully into the Mauser's shoulder, and the latter almost gasped, not from the pain. It was most like a rat, yet it had a higher forehead and closer-set eyes than either had ever seen in a rat, while its forepaws, which it constantly rubbed together in what seemed like restless glee, looked like tiny copies of the sorcerer's club hands. Simultaneously, yet independently, Fafford and the Mauser each became certain it was the beast which had gutter-escorted Slivikin and his mate, then fled, and each recalled what Ivrian had said about a witch's familiar, and Vlana about the likelihood of Clovis employing a warlock. What with the ugliness of the club-handed man and the beast, and between them the ropey black vapor coiling and twisting in the great receiver and head like a black umbilical cord, it was a most horrid sight. And the similarities, save for size, between the two creatures were even more disquieting in their implications. The tempo of the incantation quickened. The blue-white flames brightened and hissed audibly. The fluid in the curbit grew thick as lava. Great bubbles formed and loudly broke. The black rope in the receiver writhed like a nest of snakes. There was an increasing sense of invisible presences. The supernatural tension grew almost unendurable, and Fafford and the Mouser were hard put to keep silent the open-mouthed gasp by which they now breathed, and each feared his heartbeat could be heard cubits away. Abruptly the incantation peaked and broke off, like a drum struck very hard, then instantly silenced by palm and fingers outspread against the head. With a bright flash and dull explosion, cracks innumerable appeared in the curbit. Its crystal became white and opaque, yet it did not shatter or drip. The head lifted a span, hung there, fell back, while two black nooses appeared among the coils in the receiver, and suddenly narrowed until they were only two big black knots. The sorcerer grinned, rolling up the end of the parchment with a snap, and shifted his gaze from the receiver to his familiar, while the latter chittered shrilly and bounded up and down in rapture. "Silence, Slivkin! Comes now your time to race and strain and sweat," the sorcerer cried, speaking pidgin Lankarese now, but so rapidly and so squeakingly high-pitched a voice that Fafford and the Mouser could barely follow him. They did, however, both realize they had been completely mistaken as to the identity of Slivkin. In moment of disaster, the fat thief had called to the witch-beast for help, rather than to his human comrade. "Yes, master," Slivkin squeaked back no less clearly, in an instant revising the Mouser's opinion about talking animals. He continued in the same lifelike fawning tones, hearkening in obedience, Hrismallo, now they knew the sorcerer's name too, Hrismallo, ordered in whiplash pipings. "To your appointed work. See to it you summon an ample sufficiency of feasters. I want the bodies stripped to skeletons, so the bruises of the enchanted smog and all evidence of death by suffocation will be vanished utterly. But forget not the loot. On your mission now. Depart." Slivkin, who at every command had bobbed his head in manner reminiscent of his bouncing, now squealed, "I'll see it done," and grey lightning-like leaped a long leap to the floor and down an inky rat-hole. Hrismallo, grabbing together his disgusting club hands, much as Slivkin had his, cried chucklingly, "What Slevis lost, my magic has re-won." Fafford and Mouser drew back out of the doorway, partly with the thought that since neither his incantation and his alembic nor his familiar now required his unblinking attention, Hrismallo would surely look up and spot them, partly in revulsion from what they had seen and heard, and in poignant if useless pity for Slevis, whoever he might be, and for the other unknown victims of the rat-like and conceivably rat-related sorcerer's death spells. Poor strangers already dead and due to have their flesh eaten from their bones. Fafford wrested the green bottle from the Mouser, and though almost gagging on the rotten flowery reek, gulped a large, stinging mouthful. Mouser couldn't quite bring himself to do the same, but was comforted by the spirits of wine he inhaled during this by-play. Then he saw, beyond Fafford, standing before the doorway to the map-room, a richly clad man with gold-hilted knife, jewel-scabbard, at his side. His sunken-eyed face was prematurely wrinkled by responsibility, overwork, and authority, and framed by neatly cropped black hair and beard. Smiling, he silently beckoned them. The Mouser and Fafford obeyed, the latter returning the green bottle to the former, who recapped it and thrust it under the left elbow with well-concealed irritation. Each guessed their summoner was Crovus, the guild's grandmaster. Once again Fafford marveled, as he hobbled-hoyed along, reeling and belching, how Cos or the Fates were guiding him to his target tonight. The Mouser, more alert and more apprehensive too, was reminding himself that they had been directed by the Nishguards to report to Crovus, so that the situation, if not developing quite in accord with his own misty plans, was still not deviating disastrously. Yet not even his alertness, nor Fafhr's primeval instincts, gave him forewarning as they followed Clovis into the map room. 2 steps inside, each of them was shoulder-grabbed and bludgeon-menaced by a pair of ruffians, further armed with knives tucked in their belts. They judged it wise to make no resistance, on this one occasion at least, bearing out the Mouser's mouthings about the supreme caution of drunken men. "All secure, Grandmaster," one of the ruffians rapped out. Clovis swung the highest back chair around and sat down, eyeing them coolly, yet searchingly. "What brings 2 stinking, drunken beggar guildsmen into the top restricted precincts of the Masters?" he asked quietly. The Mouser felt the sweat of relief beat his forehead. The disguises he had brilliantly conceived were still working, taking in even the head man, though he had spotted Fafhr's tippiness. Resuming his blind man cover, he quavered, "We were directed by the guard above the Cheap Street door to report to you in person, great Clovis, the night beggar-master being on furlough for reasons of sexual hygiene. Tonight we've made good haul." And, fumbling in his purse, ignoring as far as possible the tightened grip on his shoulder, he brought out the golden coin given him by the sentimental courtesan, and displayed it tremble-handed. "Spare me your inexpert acting," Clovis said sharply. "I'm not one of your marks. And take that rag off your eyes." The Mouser obeyed, and stood to attention again insofar as his pinioning would permit, and smiling the more seeming carefree because of his reawakening uncertainties. Conceivably, he wasn't doing quite as brilliantly as he thought. Clovis leaned forward and said placidly, yet piercingly, "Granted you were so ordered, and most importantly so. That door-guard will suffer for his stupidity. Why were you spying into a room beyond this one when I spotted you?" "We saw brave thieves flee from that room," the Mouser answered. "Fearing that some danger threatened the guild, my comrade and I investigated, ready to scotch it." "But what we saw and heard only perplexed us, great sir," Fafhr appended quite smoothly. "I didn't ask you, sot. Speak when you're spoken to," Clovis snapped at him. Then, to the Mouser, "You're an overweening rogue, most presumptuous for your rank." In a flash, the Mouser decided that further insolence, rather than fawning, was what the situation required. "That I am, sir," he said smugly. "For example, I have a master plan whereby you and the guild might gain more wealth and power in 3 months than your predecessors have in 3 millennia." Clovis' face darkened. "Boy!" he called. Through the curtains of an inner doorway, a youth with dark complexion of a Calishite, and clad only in black loincloth, sprang to kneel before Clovis, who ordered, "Summon first my sorcerer, next the thieves Slevis and Fissive," whereupon the dark youth dashed into the corridor. Then Clovis, his face its normal pale again, leaned back in his great chair, lightly rested his sinewy arms on its great padded ones, and smilingly directed the Mouser, "Speak your piece. Reveal to us this master plan." Forcing his mind not to work on the surprising news that Slevis was not victim but thief, and not sorcery slain but alive and available, why did Clovis want him now? The Mouser threw back his head, and, shaping his lips into a faint sneer, began, "You may laugh merrily at me, Grandmaster, but I'll warrant that in less than a score of heartbeats you'll be straining sober-faced to hear my last word. Like lightning, wit can struck anywhere, and the best of you in Lankhmar have age-honored blind spots for things obvious to us of outland birth. My master plan is but this. Let Thieves' Guild, under your iron autocracy, seize supreme power in Lankhmar City, then in Lankhmar Land, next over all Nuwan, after which who knows what realms undreamt you will know your suzerainty." The Mouser had spoken true in one respect. Clovis was no longer smiling. He was leaning forward a little, and his face was darkening again, but whether from interest or anger, it was too soon to say. The Mouser continued. "For centuries, the guilds had more than the force and intelligence needed to make a coup d'etat a 9-finger certainty. Today, there's not one hair's chance in a bush head of failure. It is the proper state of things that thieves rule other men. All nature cries out for it. No need slay old Karstak. merely overmaster, control, and so rule through him. You've already feed informers in every noble or wealthy house. Your post better than the king of kings. You've a mercenary striking force permanently mobilized, should you have need of it, in the Slayer's Brotherhood. We guild beggars are your foragers. O great Crovus, the multitudes know that thievery rules Nawan, nay, the universe. Nay, more, the highest God's abode. And the multitudes accept this. They balk only at the hypocrisy of the preset arrangement, at the pretense that things are otherwise. Oh, give them their decent desire, great Crovus. Make it all open, honest, and above board, with thieves ruling in name as well as fact. The mouser spoke with passion, for the moment believing all he said, even the contradictions. The four ruffians gaped at him with wonder and not a little awe. They slackened their holds on him and on Pfeffert, too. But leaning back in his great chair again, and smiling thinly and ominously, Crovus said coolly, "In our guild, intoxication is no excuse for folly, rather grounds for the extremest penalty. But I'm well aware you organized beggars operate under a laxer discipline. So I'll deign to explain to you, you wee drunken dreamer, that we thieves know well that, behind the scenes, we already rule Lankhmar, Nawan, all life, in sooth. For what is life but greed in action? But to make this an open thing would not only force us to take on 10,000 sorts of weary work others now do for us, it would also go against another of life's deep laws, illusion. Does the sweetmeats hawker show you his kitchen? Does a whore let average client watch her enamel over her wrinkles and hoist her sagging breasts in cunning-gauding slings? Does a conjurer turn out for you his hidden pockets? Nature works by subtle, secret means. Man's invisible seed, spider bite, the viewless spores of madness and of death, rocks that are born in earth's unknown bowels, the silent stars that creep across the sky, and we thieves copy her." "That's good enough poetry, sir," Pfeffert responded with undertone of angry derision, for he had himself been considerably impressed by the mouser's master plan, and was irked that Crovus should do insult to his new friend by disposing of it so lightly. "Closet kingship may work well enough in easy times, but," he paused histrionically, "will it serve when Thieves' Guild is faced with an enemy determined to obliterate it forever? A plot to wipe it out entirely from the earth?" "What drunken babble's this?" Crovus demanded, sitting up straight. "What plot?" "'Tis a most secret one," Pfeffert responded, grinning, delighted to pay this haughty man in his own coin, and thinking it quite just that the Thief-King sweat a little before his head was removed for conveyance to Vlana. "I know not of it, except that many a master thief is marked down for the knife, and your head doomed to fall." Pfeffert merely sneered his face and folded his arms, the still slack grip of his captors readily permitting it, his sword, crutch, hanging against his body from his lightly gripping hand. Then he scowled as there came a sudden shooting pain in his numbed, bound-up left leg, which he had forgotten for a space. Crovus raised clenched fists, and himself half out of his chair, in prelude to some fearsome command, likely that Pfeffert be tortured. The mouser cut in hurriedly with, "The Secret Seven, they're called, are its leaders. None of the outer circles of the conspiracy know their names, though rumor has it that they're secret guild thief renegades, representing one for each, the cities of All Hursip, Kravachnar, Ithmar, Horboxian, Tilsmet, Far Curay, and Lankhmar's very self. It's thought they're moneyed by the merchants of the East, the priests of Wan, the sorcerers of the steppes, and half the Mingal leadership, too, Legend and Quarmal, Arth assassins and Sneermere, and also no lesser man than the King of Kings." Despite Crovus's contemptuous and then angry remarks, the ruffians holding the mouser continued to hearken to their captive with interest and respect, and they did not retighten their grip on him. His colorful revelations and melodramatic delivery held them, while Crovus's dry, cynical, philosophic observations largely went over their heads. Hirschmolo came gliding into the room then, his feet presumably taking swift but very short steps. At any rate, his black robe hung undisturbed to the marble floor, despite his slithering speed. There was a shock at his entrance. All eyes in the map room followed him, breaths were held, and the Mouser and Fafford felt the horny hands that gripped them shake just a little. Even Crovis's all-confident, world-weary expression became tense and guardedly uneasy. Clearly, the sorcerer of the Thieves' Guild was more feared than loved by his chief employer and by the beneficiaries of his skill. Outwardly oblivious to this reaction to his appearance, Rostmo, smiling thin-lipped, halted close to one side of Crovis's chair and inclined his hood-shadowed rodent face in the ghost of a bow. Crovis held palm toward the Mouser for silence. Then, wetting his lips, he asked Rostmo sharply, yet nervously, "Do you know these two?" Rostmo nodded decisively. "They just now peered a befuddled eye each at me," he said, "whilst I was about that business we spoke of. I'd have shooed them off, reported them, save such action might have broken my spell, put my words out of time with the alembic's workings. The one's a northerner, the other's features have the southern cast, from Tovis or near, most like. Both younger than their now looks. Freelance bravos, I'd judge 'em, the sort the Brotherhood hires as extras when they get at once several big guard and escort jobs. Clumsily disguised now, of course, as beggars." Fulford by yawning, the Mouser by pitying headshake, tried to convey that all this was so much poor guesswork. "It's all I can tell you without reading their minds," he concluded. "Shall I fetch my lights and mirrors?" "Not yet." Corvus turned face and shot a finger at the Mouser. "How do you know these things you rant about? Seven secret and all. Straight, simplest answer now. No rhodomontaz." The Mouser replied most glibly. "There's a new courtesan dwells on Pimp Street. Tarja, her name. Tall, beauteous, but hunchbacked, which oddly delights many of her clients. Now Tarja loves me 'cause my maimed eyes match her twisted spine, or from simply pity of my blindness, and youth, or from some old odd itch, like her clients for her, which that combination arouses in her flesh. Now one of her patrons, a trader newly come from Cleeg Street, from Cleeg Morph he's named, was impressed by my intelligence, strength, boldness, and closed-mouthed tact, and those same qualities in my comrade, too. Morph sounded us out, finally asking if we hated the Thieves' Guild for its control of the Beggars' Guild. Sensing a chance to aid the guild, we played up, and a week ago he recruited us into a cell of 3 in the outermost strands of the conspiracy web of the 7. "You presume to do all of this on your own?" Crovis demanded in freezing tones, sitting up straight and gripping hard the chair arms. "Oh, no," the Mouser denied guilelessly. "We reported our every act to the day beggarmaster, and he approved them, told us to spy our best, and gather every scrap of fact and rumor we could about the Seven's conspiracy." "And he told me not a word about it?" Crovis rapped out. "If true, I'll have Bennett's head for this. But you're lying, aren't you?" As the Mouser gazed with wounded eyes at Crovis, meanwhile preparing a most virtuous denial, a portly man limped past the doorway with help of a gilded staff. He moved with silence and aplomb. But Crovis saw him. "Night Beggarmaster," he called sharply. The limping man stopped, turned, came crippling majestically through the door. Crovis stabbed finger at the Mouser, then Fafford. "Do you know these two, Flim?" The Night Beggarmaster unhurriedly studied each for a space, then shook his head with its turban cloth of gold. "Never seen either before. What are they, think beggars?" "But Flim wouldn't know us," the Mouser explained desperately, feeling everything collapsing in on him and Fafford. "All our contacts were with Bannett alone." Flim said quietly, "Bannett's been abed with the swamp ague this past 10 day. Meanwhile, I have been day beggarmaster, as well as night." At that moment, Slevis and Fissive came hurrying in behind Flim. The tall thief bore on his jaw a bluish lump. The fat thief's head was bandaged above his darting eyes. He pointed quickly at Fafford and the Mouser and cried, "There are the two that slugged us, took our Django loot, and slew our escort." The Mouser lifted his elbow, and the green bottle crashed to shards at his feet on the hard marble. Gardenia rink sprang swiftly through the air. But more swiftly still, the Mouser, shaking off the careless hold of his startled guards, sprang toward Crovis, clubbing his wrapped-up sword. If he could only overpower the king of thieves and hold Cat's Claw at his throat, he'd be able to bargain for his and Fafford's lives. That is, unless the other thieves wanted their master killed, which wouldn't surprise him at all. With startling speed, Flim thrust out his gilded staff, tripping the mouser, who went head over heels, midway seeking to change his involuntary somersault into a voluntary one. Meanwhile, Fafford lurched heavily against his left-handed captor, at the same time swinging bandaged grey wand strongly upward to strike his right-hand captor under the jaw. Regaining his one-leg balance with a mighty contortion, he hopped for the loot wall behind him. Slevis made for the wall of thieves' tools, and with a muscle-cracking effort, wrenched the great pry bar from its padlocked ring. Scrambling to his feet after a poor landing in front of Crovis' chair, the mouser found it empty, and the thief-king in a half-crouch behind it, gold-hilted dagger drawn, deep-sunk eyes coldly battle-wild. Spinning around, he saw Fafford's guards on the floor, the one sprawled senseless, the other starting to scramble up, while the great northerner, his back against the wall of weird jewelry, menaced the whole room with wrapped-up grey wand, and with his long knife, jerked from its scabbard behind him. Likewise, drawing Cat's Claw, the mouser cried in trumpet voice of battle, "Stand aside, all! He's gone mad! I'll hamstring his good leg for you!" And racing through the press and between his own two guards, who still appeared to hold him in some awe, he launched himself with flashing dirk at Fafford, praying that the northerner, drunk now with battle as well as wine and poisonous perfume, would recognize him and guess his stratagem. Grey Wand slashed well above his ducking head. His new friend not only guessed, but was playing up, and not just missing by accident, the mouser hoped. Stooping low by the wall, he cut the lashings on Fafford's left leg. Grey Wand and Fafford's long knife continued to spare him. Springing up, he headed for the corridor, crying over shoulder to Fafford, "Come on!" Ristamo stood well out of the way, quietly observing. Fisif scuttled towards safety. Crovis stayed behind his chair, shouting, "Stop them! Head them off!" The three remaining ruffian guards, at last beginning to recover their fighting wits, gathered to oppose the mouser. But menacing them with swift feints of his dirk, he slowed them and darted between, then, just in the nick of time, knocked aside with a downsweep of wrapped-up scalpel Flim's gilded staff, thrust once again to trip him. All this gave Slevis time to return from the tools wall and aim at the mouser a great swinging blow with the massive pry bar. But even that blow started a very long bandaged sword on a very long arm thrust over the mouser's shoulder and solidly and heavily poked Slevis high on his chest, jolting him backward so that the pry bar swing was short and whistled past harmlessly. Then the mouser found himself in the corridor, and Fafford beside him, though for some weird reason still only hopping. The mouser pointed toward the stairs. Fafford nodded, but delayed to reach high, still on one leg, only, and rip off the nearest wall a dozen cubits of heavy drapes, which he threw across the corridor to baffle pursuit. They reached the stairs, and started up the next flight, the mouser in advance. There were cries behind, some muffled. "Stop hopping, Fafford," the mouser ordered querulously. "You've got two legs again." "Yes, and the other's still dead," Fafford complained. "Ugh! Now feeling begins to return to it." A thrown knife whisked between them, and dully clinked as it hit the wall point first, and stone powder flew. Then they were on the bend. Two more empty corridors, two more curving flights, and then they saw above them on the last landing a stout ladder mounting to a dark square hole in the roof. A thief with hair bound back by a colorful handkerchief, it appeared to be a doors guard's identification, menaced the mouser with drawn sword, but when he saw that there were two of them, both charging him determinedly with shining knives and strange staves of clubs, he turned and ran down the last empty corridor. The mouser, followed closely by Fafford, rapidly mounted the ladder and, without pause, vaulted up through the hatch into the star-crossed night. He found himself near the unrailed edge of slate roof, which slanted enough to have made it look most fearsome to a novice roof-walker, but safe as houses to a veteran. Crouched on the long peak of the roof was another kerchiefed thief holding a dark lantern. He was rapidly covering and uncovering, presumably in some code, the lantern's bull's-eye, whence shot a faint green beam north, to where a red point of light winked dimly in reply. As far away as the sea-wall it looked, or perhaps the masthead of a ship beyond, riding in the inner sea? Smuggler? Seeing the mouser, this one instantly drew sword, and swinging the lantern a little in his other hand, advanced menacingly. The mouser eyed him warily. The dark lantern, with its hot metal, concealed flame, and store of oil, would be a tricky weapon. But then Fafford had clambered out, and was standing beside the mouser, on both feet again at last. Their adversary backed slowly away toward the north end of the roof ridge. Fleetingly, the mouser wondered if there was another hatch there. Turning back at a bumping sound, he saw Fafford prudently hoisting the ladder. Just as he got it free, a knife flashed up close past him out of the hatch. While following its flight, the mouser frowned, involuntarily admiring the skill required to hurl a knife vertically with any accuracy. It clattered down near them and slid off the roof. The mouser loped south across the slates, and was halfway from the hatch to that end of the roof when the faint chink came of the knife striking the cobbles of Murder Alley. Fafford followed more slowly, in part perhaps from a lesser experience of roofs, in part because he still limped a bit to favor his left leg, and in part because he was carrying the heavy ladder balanced on his right shoulder. "We won't need that," the mouser called back. Without hesitation, Fafford heaved it joyously over the edge. By the time it crashed in Murder Alley, the mouser was leaping down 2 yards and across a gap of one of the next roof, of opposite and lesser pitch. Fafford landed beside him. The mouser led them at almost a run through a sooty forest of chimneys, chimney pots, ventilators with tails that made them always face the wind, black-legged cisterns, hatch covers, birdhouses, and pigeon traps, across 5 roofs, 4 progressively a little lower, the 5th regaining a yard of the altitude they'd lost. The spaces between the buildings easy to leap, none more than 3 yards, no ladder bridge required, and only one roof with a somewhat greater pitch than that of the thieves' house, until they reached the Street of Thinkers at a point where it was crossed by a roof passageway, much like the one at Rackerman's and Slog's. While they crossed it at a crouching lope, something hissed close past them and clattered ahead. As they leaped down from the roof of the bridge, 3 more somethings hissed over their heads to clatter beyond. One rebounded from a square chimney, almost to the mouser's feet. He picked it up, expecting a stone, and was surprised by the greater weight of a leaden ball, big as 2 doubled-up fingers. They, he said, jerking thumb over shoulder, lost no time in getting slingers on the roof. When roused, they're good. Southeast, then, through another black chimney forest to a point on Cheap Street, where upper stories overhung the street so much on either side that it was easy to leap the gap. During this roof traverse, an advancing front of night smog, dense enough to make them cough and wheeze, had engulfed them, and for perhaps 60 heartbeats the mouser had to slow to a shuffle and feel his way, Fafford's hand on his shoulder. Just short of Cheap Street, they had come abruptly and completely out of the smog, and seen the stars again, while the black front had rolled off northward behind them. Now what the devil was that? Fafford had asked, and the mouser had shrugged. A nighthawk would have seen a vast thick hoop of black night smog blowing out in all directions from a center near the Silver Eel, growing ever greater and greater in diameter and circumferences. East of Cheap Street, the 2 comrades soon made their way to the ground, landing back in Plague Court, behind the narrow premises of Natick Numblefingers, the tailor. Then at last they looked at each other, and their trammeled swords and their filthy faces and clothing made dirtier still by roof soot, and they laughed and laughed, Fafford roaring still as he bent over to massage his left leg and below knee. This hooting and wholly unaffected self-mockery continued while they unwrapped their swords, the mouser as if his were a surprise package, and clipped their scabbards once more to their belts. Their exertions had burned out of them the last mote and atomy of strong wine, and even stronger stenchful perfume, but they felt no desire whatever for more drink, only the urge to get home, eat hugely, and guzzle lot bitter gava, and tell their lovely girls the tale of their mad adventure. They loped on side by side, at intervals glancing at each other and chuckling, though keeping a normally wary eye behind and before for pursuit or interception, despite their expecting neither. Free of night smog, and drizzled with starlight, their cramped surroundings seemed much less stinking and oppressive than when they had set out. Even Hors d'oeuvre Boulevard had a freshness to it. Only once, for a brief space, did they grow serious. Fafford said, "You're a drunken idiot genius indeed tonight, even if I was a drunken clodhopper. Lashing up my leg, tying up our swords so we couldn't use 'em save as clubs." The mouser shrugged. "Yet that sword tying doubtless saved us from committing a number of murders tonight." Fafford retorted a little hotly. "Killing in fight isn't murder." Again the mouser shrugged. "Killing is murder, no matter what nice names you give it. Just as eating is devouring and drinking is guzzling. Gods, I'm dry, famished, and fatigued. Come on, soft cushions, food, and steaming gava." They hastened up the long, creaking, broken-treaded stairs with an easy carefulness, and when they were both on the porch, the mouser shoved at the door to open it with surprised swiftness. It did not budge. "Bolted," he said to Fafford shortly. He noted now there was hardly any light at all coming through the cracks around the door, or noticeable through the lattices. At most, a faint orange-red glow. Then, with sentimental grin, and in a fond voice in which only the ghost of uneasiness lurked, he said, "They've gone to sleep, the unworrying wenches." He knocked loudly thrice, and then, cupping his lips, shouted softly at the door, "Hola, Ivrian, I'm home safe." "Hail, Flana, your man's done you proud, felling guild thieves innumerable with 1 foot tied behind his back." There was no sound whatever from inside. That is, if one discounted a rustling so faint it was impossible to be sure of it. Fafford was wrinkling his nostrils. "I smell smoke." The mouser banged on the door again. Still no response. Fafford motioned him out of the way, hunching his big shoulder to crash the portal. The mouser shook his head, and with a deft tap, slide and tug, removed a brick that a moment before had looked firm-set, part of the wall beside the door. He reached in all his arm. There was the scrape of a bolt being withdrawn, then another, then a third. He swiftly recovered his arm, and the door swung fully inward at a touch. But neither he nor Fafford rushed in at once, as both had intended to, for the indefinable scent of danger and the unknown came puffing out along with an increased reek of smoke and a slight sickening sweet scent that, though female, was no decent female perfume, and a musty, sour animal odor. They could see the room faintly by the orange glow coming from the small oblong of the open door of the little, well-black stove. Yet the oblong did not sit properly upright, but was unnaturally atilt. Clearly the stove had been half overset, and now leaned against the side wall of the fireplace, its small door fallen open in that direction. By itself alone, that unnatural angle conveyed the entire impact of a universe overturned. The orange glow showed the carpets oddly rucked up, with here and there black circles of a palm's breadth across, the neatly stacked candles scattered about below their shelves, along with some of the jars and enameled boxes, and, above all, 2 black, low, irregular longish heaps, and one by the fireplace, the other half on the golden couch, half at its foot. From each head there stared at the mouser and Fafford innumerable pairs of tiny, rather widely set, furnace-red eyes. On the thickly carpeted floor on the other side of the fireplace was a silver cobweb, a fallen silver cage, but no love birds sang from it. There was a faint scrape of metal as Fafford made sure Grey Wand was loose in its scabbard. As if that tiny sound had beforehand been chosen as a signal for attack, each instantly whipped out sword, and they advanced side by side into the room, warily at first, testing the floor with each step. At the screech of the swords being drawn, the tiny furnace-red eyes had winked and shifted restlessly, and now with the 2 men's approach, they swiftly scattered, pattering, pair by red pair, each pair at the forward end of a low, slender, hairless-tailed black body, and each making for one of the black circles in the rugs, where they vanished. Indubitably, the black circles were rat holes newly gnawed up through the floor and rugs, while the red-eyed creatures were black rats. Fafford and the mouser sprang forward, slashing and chopping at them in a frenzy, cursing and human snarling besides. They sundered few. The rats fled with preternatural swiftness, most of them disappearing down holes near the walls and the fireplace. Also, Fafford's first frantic chop went through the floor, and on his third step, with an ominous crack and splintering his leg, plunged through the floor to his hip. The mouser darted past him, unmindful of further crackings. Fafford heaved out his trap leg, not even noting the splinter scratches it got, and as unmindful as the mouser of the continuing creakings. The rats were gone. He lunged after his comrade, who had thrust a bunch of kindlers into the stove to make more light. The horror was that although the rats were all gone, the 2 longish heaps remained, although considerably diminished, and as now shown clearly by the yellow flames leaping from the black tilted door changed in hue. No longer were the heaps red-beaded black, but a mixture of gleaming black and dark brown, a sickening purple-blue, violet and velvet black and ermine white, and the reds of stockings and blood and bloody flesh and bone. Although hands and feet had been gnawed bone-naked, and bodies tunneled heart-deep, the two faces had been spared. That was not good, for they were the parts purple-brown, purple-blue from death by strangulation, lips drawn back, eyes bulging, all features contorted in agony. Only the black and very dark brown hair gleamed unchanged, that and the white teeth. As each man stared down at his love, unable to look away despite the waves of horror and grief and rage washing higher and higher, each saw a tiny black strand uncurl from the black depression, wringing each throat, and drift off, dissipating toward the open door behind them, 2 strands of night smog. With a crescendo of crackings, the floor sagged fully 3 spans more in the center before arriving at a new temporary stability. Edges of centrally tortured minds noted details. Litvana's silver-hilted dagger skewered to the floor a rat, which, likely enough, overeager had approached too closely before the night smog had done its magic work. That her belt and pouch were gone. That the blue enameled box inlaid with silver, in which Ivrian had put the Mouser's share of the hijacked jewels, was gone too. The Mouser and Fafhrd lifted to each other white, drawn faces, which were quite mad, yet completely joined in understanding and purpose. No need to tell each other what must have happened here with the 2 nooses of black vapor jerked tight, or why Slivkin had bounced and squeaked in glee, or the significance of such phrases as an ample sufficiency of feasters, or forget not the loot, or that business we spoke of. No need for Fafhrd to explain why he now stripped off his robe and hood, or why he jerked up Valana's dagger, snapped the rat off it with a wrist flick, and thrust it in his belt. No need for the Mouser to tell why he searched out a half-dozen jars of oil, and after smashing 3 of them in front of the flaming stove, paused, thought, and struck the other 3 in the sack at his waist, adding to them the remaining kindlers and the firepot, brimming with red coals, its top lashed down tight. Then, still without word exchanged, the Mouser muffled his hand with a small rug, and reaching into the fireplace, deliberately tipping the flames forward so that it fell door down on oil-soaked rugs. Yellow flames sprang up around him. They turned and raced for the door. With louder crackings than before, the floor collapsed. They desperately scrambled their way up a steep hill of sliding carpets and reached the door and porch just before all behind them gave way, and the flaming rugs and stove, and all the firewood and candles, and the golden couch, and all the little tables and boxes and jars, and the unthinkably mutilated bodies of their first loves, cascaded into the dry, dusty, cobweb-choked room below, and the great flames of a cleansing, or at least obliterating cremation, began to flare upward. They plunged down the stairs, which tore away from the wall and collapsed and dully crashed in the dark just as they reached the ground. They had to fight their way over the wreckage to get to Bones Alley. By then, flames were darting their bright lizard tongues out of the shuttered attic windows and the boarded-up ones in the storages below. By the time they reached Plague Court, running side by side at top speed, the Silver Eel's fire alarm was clanging cacophonously behind them. They were still sprinting when they took the Death Alley fork. Then Mouser grappled Fafhrd and forced him to a halt. The big man struck out, cursing insanely, and only desisted, his white face still a lunatic's, when the Mouser cried, panting, "Only 10 heartbeats to arm us." He pulled the sack from his belt, and keeping tight hold of its neck, crashed it on the cobbles, hard enough to smash not only the bottles of oil, but also the firepot, for the sack was soon flaming a little at its base. Then he drew gleaming scalpel, and Fafhrd Greywand, and they raced on, the Mouser swinging his sack in a great circle beside him to fan its flames. It was a veritable ball of fire burning in his left hand as they dashed across Cheap Street and into Thieves' House, and the Mouser, leaping high, swung it up into the great niche above the doorway and let go of it. The niche guards screeched in surprise and pain at the fire invader of their hidey-hole, and had no time to do anything with their swords, or whatever weapons else they had, against the 2 invaders. Student thieves poured out of the doors ahead at the screeching and foot-pounding, and then poured back as they saw the fierce point of flames and the two demon-faced oncomers brandishing their long shining swords. One skinny little apprentice, he could hardly have been 10 years old, lingered too long. Graywan thrust him pitilessly through his big eyes bulged, and his small mouth gaped in horror and plea to Fafhrd for mercy. Now from ahead of them there came a weird wailing call, hollow and hair-raising, and the doors began to thud shut instead of spewing forth the armed guards they almost prayed would appear as to be skewered by their swords. Also, despite the long bracketed torches looking newly renewed, the corridor was dark. The reason for this last became clear as they plunged up the stairs. Strands of night smog were appearing in the well, materializing from nothing or the air. The strands grew longer and more numerous and tangible. They touched and clung nastily. In the corridor above they were forming from wall to wall and from ceiling to floor like a gigantic cobweb, and were becoming so substantial that the Mouser and Fafhrd had to slash them to get through, or so their two manic minds believed. The black web muffled a repetition of the eerie wailing call which came from the seventh door ahead, and this time ended in a gleeful chittering and cackling insane as the emotion of the two attackers. Here too doors were thudding shut. In an ephemeral flash of rationality, it occurred to the Mouser that it was not he and Fafhrd the thieves feared, for they had not been seen yet, but rather Hrustamo and his magic, even though working in defense of Thieves' House. Even the map room, whence counterattack would most likely erupt, was closed off by a huge oaken iron-studded door. They were now twice slashing black-clinging, rope-thick spiderweb for every single step they drove themselves forward. Midway between the map and the magic rooms, there was forming on the inky web, ghostly at first, but swiftly growing more substantial, a black spider, big as a wolf. The Mouser slashed heavy cobweb before it, dropped back 2 steps, then hurled himself at it in high leaps. Scalpel thrust through it, striking amidst its 8 new-formed jet eyes, and it collapsed like a daggered bladder, loosing a vile stink. Then he and Fafhrd were looking into the magic room, the alchemist's chamber. It was much as they'd seen it before, except some things were doubled, or multiplied even further. On the long table, 2 blue-boiled Curbits bubbled and roiled, their heads shooting out a solid writhing rope more swiftly than moves the black swamp cobra, which can run down a man, and not into twin receivers, but into the open air of the room, if any of the air in Thieves' House could have been called open, to weave a barrier between their swords and Hrustamo, who once more stood tall though hunchbacked over his sorcerous brown parchment, though this time his exultant gaze was chiefly fixed on Fafhrd and the Mouser, with only an occasional downward glance at the text of the spell he drummingly intoned. At the other end of the table, in the web-free space, there bounced not only Slivikin, but also a huge rat matching him in size, in all the members except the head. From the rat holes at the foot of the walls, red eyes glittered and gleamed in pairs. With a bellow of rage, Fafhrd began slashing at the black barrier, but the ropes were replaced from the Kirkabet heads as swiftly as he sliced them, while the cut ends, instead of drooping slackly, now began to strain hungrily toward him, like constrictive snakes or strangle vines. He suddenly shifted Graywan to his left hand, drew his long knife, and hurled it at the sorcerer. Flashing toward its mark, it cut through 3 strands, was deflected, and slowed by a 4th and 5th, almost halted by a 6th, and ended hanging futilely in the curled grip of a 7th. Hrustamo laughed cacklingly and grinned, showing his huge upper incisors, while Slivikin chittered in ecstasy and bounded the higher. The Mouser hurled Cat's Claw with no better result. Worse, indeed, since his action gave 2 darting smoke strands time to curl hamperingly around his sword hand and stranglingly around his neck. Black rats came racing out of the big holes at the cluttered base of the walls. Meanwhile, other strands snaked around Fafhrds's ankles, knees, and left arm, almost toppling him. But even as he fought for balance, he jerked Vlana's dagger from his belt and raised it over his shoulder, the silver hilt glowing its blade brown with dried rat's blood. The grin left Hristomo's face as he saw it. The sorcerer screamed strangely and importuningly, then, and drew back from his parchment and the table, and raised clawed club hands to ward off doom. Lorna's dagger sped unimpeding through the black web. Its strands even seemed to part for it, and betwixt the sorcerer's warding hands to bury itself to the hilt in his right eye. He screamed thinly in dire agony and clawed at his face. The black web writhed as if in death spasm. The Kirkabits shattered as one, spilling their lava on the scarred table, putting out the blue flames even as the thick wood of the table began to smoke a little at the lava's edge. Lava dropped with plops on the dark marble floor. With a faint, final scream, Hristomo pitched forward, hand still clutched to his eyes above his jutting nose, silver dagger hilt still protruding between his fingers. The web grew faint, like wet ink washed with a gush of clear water. The mouser raced forward and transfixed Livikin and the huge rat with one thrust of scalpel before the beast knew what was happening. They too died swiftly with thin screams, while all the other rats turned tail and fled back down their holes, swift almost as black lightning. Then the last trace of night smog, or sorcery smoke, vanished, and Fafhrd and the mouser found themselves standing alone, with 3 dead bodies, and a profound silence that seemed to fill not only this room, but all of Thieves' House. Even the Kirkabit lava had ceased to move, was hardening, and the wood of the table no longer smoked. Their madness was gone, and all their rage too, vented to the last red atomy, and glutted to more than satiety. They had no more urge to kill Crovus, or any other of the thieves, than to swat flies. With horrified inner eye, Fafhrd saw the pitiful face of the child thief he'd skewered in his lunatic anger. Only their grief remained with them, diminished not one whit, but rather growing greater. That and an even more swiftly growing revulsion from all that was around them. The dead, the disordered magic room, all Thieves' House, all of the city of Lankhmar, to its last stinking alleyway, and smog-wreathed spire. With a hiss of disgust, the mouser jerked scalpel from the rodent cadavers, wiped it on the nearest cloth, and returned it to its scabbard. Fafhrd likewise sketchily cleansed and sheathed Grey Wand. Then the 2 men picked up their knife and dirk from where they'd dropped to the floor when the web had dematerialized, though neither so much as glanced at Vlana's dagger where it was buried. But on the sorcerer's table they did notice Vlana's black velvet silver-worked pouch and belt, the latter half overrun by the hardened black lava, and Ivrian's blue enameled box inlaid with silver. From these they took the gems of Jengo. With no more word than they had exchanged back at the mouser's burned nest behind the eel, but with a continuing sense of their unity of purpose, their identity of intent, and of their comradeship, they made their way with shoulders bowed and with a slow, weary step, which they only very gradually quickened, out of the magic room, and down the thick-carpeted corridor, past the map room's wide door still barred with oak and iron, and past all the other shut, silent doors. Clearly the entire guild was terrified of Hristomo, his spells, and his rats. Down the echoing stairs, their footsteps speeding a little, down the bare-floored lower corridor, past its closed, quiet doors, their footsteps resounding loudly, no matter how softly they sought to tread. Under the deserted, black-scorched Gardenish, and so out into Cheap Street, turning left and north, because that was the nearest way to the Street of the Gods, and there, turning right and east, not a waking soul in the wide street, except for one skinny, bent-backed apprentice lad, unhappily swabbing the flagstones in front of a wine shop in the dim-peaked